She woke up to a stranger's face and a ring she didn't recognize. The man sitting beside her hospital bed had dark circles under his eyes, a rumpled suit jacket draped over the chair behind him, and the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in days. Not because he couldn't, but because he refused to leave. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not pity, not relief. Something rawer than both. "Sophia," he said quietly, like he'd been practicing how to say it without breaking. She looked down at her left hand, a simple gold band. No diamond, just gold, worn smooth at the edges like it had been on her finger for years. It hadn't. She was almost certain of that. Almost. Smash cut to title. The ring. She couldn't remember. If you've ever questioned a decision you made, a choice that changed everything, but couldn't remember making it, stay with us. Drop your city in the comments right now, wherever you're watching from. Let me see how far this story travels. Like this video, because we're just getting started, and I promise you, nothing about this story is what it looks like. The fluorescent lights in room 214 of Mercy General Hospital hummed the way fluorescent lights always hum. That flat, tuneless drone that lives somewhere between sound and headache. It was the first thing Sophia Harper became aware of. The sound. Then the smell. Industrial cleaner and something floral, probably from the arrangement of white lilies on the windowsill that she'd learned later he'd brought every day for 11 days. Then the pain. It arrived not as a sharp thing, but as a general wrongness, a heaviness behind her eyes and a stiffness in her left shoulder that told her body had been through something before her mind had time to catch up with what. She blinked. The ceiling was white and pocked with small holes, like someone had been throwing pencils at it for years. A water stain in the corner shaped vaguely like the state of Florida, the kind of detail her brain cataloged automatically. The habit of a woman who'd spent years sitting at pianos waiting for students to arrive and finding shapes in everything. Piano. The word arrived first, then the image. Her hands on keys, a little boy named Marcus who always sat too far from the bench, a room that smelled like old carpet and rosin, and whatever her community center always smelled like after the afternoon classes. Chalk dust, maybe, or just the particular scent of a building that had been loved harder than it had been maintained. She knew that room. She knew that smell. She knew herself in it. She moved her left hand. The ring caught the fluorescent light. Sophia Harper stared at it for a long moment. Her mouth was dry. Her thoughts were moving like something submerged, present, but slow, pulling against resistance. That's not mine. Except it was on her finger. Except the skin around it had the slight indentation of something worn for more than a few days. Except... Hey! The voice came from her right. She turned her head slowly, because turning it fast sent a spike of pain through the back of her skull, and she found him. He was sitting in a visitor's chair that had clearly been dragged close to the bed at some point and never moved back. He was dressed in what had probably been an expensive charcoal suit at the beginning of the week, but now had the lived-in quality of something slept in. He had dark hair, a jaw that needed a shave, and eyes, dark brown, almost black in the hospital light, that were watching her with the careful attention of someone who had been sitting with a very fragile thing and was terrified of what happened next. He was, objectively, a handsome man. He was also a complete stranger. "Hey," he said again, and his voice cracked a little on the single syllable. "You're awake." Sophia opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Where am I?" Something moved across his face, too fast to read. "Mercy General," he said. "You've been here 11 days. 11... She stopped. What happened? "A car accident." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. He was trying to look calm. He wasn't entirely succeeding. "A driver ran a red light on Caldwell and Fifth. Your cab took the impact on the passenger side. You had a..." He paused. "Significant head injury. They kept you sedated for most of the first week." Sophia processed this in pieces. Car accident. Caldwell and Fifth. That was 12 blocks from the community center. She'd been going home, or coming from, or... She couldn't find it. The night. The specific memory of that night. She reached for it the way you reach for a word that's on the tip of your tongue, and it wasn't there. Okay, she said carefully. And you are... The look on his face this time she couldn't miss. It moved through him like a current, from his jaw to his hands to his eyes, and for a split second she thought the man was going to cry. He didn't. He pulled it back with what looked like considerable effort. I'm Ethan, he said quietly. Ethan Kingston. The name meant nothing to her. She looked down at the ring. Then she looked back at him. And she saw him watching her figure it out, watched the moment he understood from her face that she had figured it out, and watched him absorb the impact of that understanding with the particular stillness of a man who had been bracing for it. We're married, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, he said. We are. The doctor's name was Ramirez, 50s, efficient, the kind of physician who delivered information the way good contractors gave estimates, clearly, without cushioning, because sugarcoating rarely helped anyone make good decisions. He stood at the foot of Sophia's bed with her chart and explained what had happened to her brain the way you might explain a complicated plumbing issue. The impact had caused a subdural hematoma, bleeding between the brain tissue and its outer covering. They'd operated. She'd been lucky, insofar as lucky applied to any part of the situation. The bleed had been controlled. The swelling had resolved. But there had been damage to the hippocampal region, the part of the brain responsible for consolidating recent memories into long-term storage. What does that mean? Sophia asked. It means, Dr. Ramirez said carefully, that the memories you formed in the weeks leading up to your accident are likely unrecoverable. Your long-term memory, your childhood, your education, your professional history, your established relationships, appears intact, but the most recent period, probably 4 to 6 weeks before the accident, possibly slightly longer, is effectively gone. Sophia let that settle. Gone as in they'll come back eventually? Gone as in probably not, Dr. Ramirez said. I want to be honest with you rather than give you false expectations. Some patients recover fragments. Dreams occasionally, or strong sensory triggers can unlock pieces. But you should prepare yourself for the possibility that this particular window of your life won't return. She looked at the ring again. And that window includes your marriage, Doctor. Ramirez confirmed with the gentle efficiency of someone who had delivered hard news enough times to know there was no good way to package it. Yes. Based on what Mr. Kingston has told us about the timeline, your wedding falls within the affected period. The room was very quiet for a moment. Ethan Kingston had not come back in with the doctor. He'd excused himself, stepped out, he'd said, to get coffee, and she'd watched him go and noted that he hadn't looked back at the door on his way out, like he was giving her a deliberate and specific gift of room to breathe. She wasn't sure what to make of that. Do I have family I should contact? She asked. Mr. Kingston has already been in touch with your mother. She's been here several times. She wanted to be here when you woke up, but she had to return to... Dr. Ramirez checked the chart. Macon. She's 3 hours away. He has her number ready for you. He has her number ready. Her husband had her mother's phone number ready for when she woke up. She didn't know this man's last name an hour ago. I'd like some time, Sophia said. Of course. Dr. Ramirez nodded. There's no rush on anything. You've been through significant trauma. Rest is the primary prescription right now. He left. Sophia Harper lay in the hospital bed in room 214 and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and tried to inventory herself. She was 30 years old. She had an apartment on Delaney Street, a third-floor walk-up with a radiator that banged in February and a window that looked out onto a fire escape where the neighbor 2 floors up grew tomatoes in the summer. She drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a crack in the windshield that she kept meaning to fix. She taught piano at the Caldwell Community Music Center, where she'd been an instructor for 4 years. She had 22 students ranging in age from 7 to 63, and she knew all of their names and most of their bad habits. She had a mother in Macon. She had a best friend named Diana who worked at the public library. She had a ring on her left hand and a husband she didn't know. She pressed her palm flat against the mattress and breathed slowly, the way she made her students breathe when their nerves seized up before a recital. 4 beats in. Hold 2. 4 beats out. None of this made sense. Ethan Kingston came back 20 minutes later with 2 cups of hospital coffee and a look that said he knew the coffee was bad, but it needed something to do with his hands. He set 1 cup on the tray beside her bed without asking. Then he sat back down in his chair. "You don't have to stay," Sophia said. "I know." She studied him. He didn't look like what she would have pictured if someone had said the words billionaire single father to her in the abstract. He didn't have the polished untouchability of the men she saw in the business section of the newspaper, the ones whose photos always seemed airbrushed of any evidence that they'd ever been tired or uncertain. He looked like someone who had been tired and uncertain for 11 days and was not bothering to hide it. "Kingston," she said slowly, testing the name. "Ethan Kingston." "Yes. Kingston Properties." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the careful stillness of someone who wasn't sure yet whether this was going somewhere good or bad. "Among other things," he said. Kingston Properties was a name she knew. Everyone in the city knew it. A real estate and development company that had been buying and renovating urban properties for 15 years, the kind of company that showed up in the city section and occasionally in the national business press. She thought the founder, the current CEO, was in his 30s. She hadn't known his first name, Ethan. She looked at the ring on her finger. Simple gold, no diamond. The ring of a woman who had insisted on something modest, or the ring of a man who understood she would have wanted something modest. She didn't know which. "We need to talk about some things," she said. "Yes," he agreed. I need you to understand that I don't remember you, any of you. Whatever happened between us, I can't." She stopped. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I just need you to know where I am." "I know where you are," Ethan said. His voice was even. She noticed he was careful about keeping it even. "And I'm not going to pretend that doesn't—" He paused, pressed his lips together briefly. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter, but it doesn't change anything that I need to do." "Which is what?" "Make sure you're okay," he said simply. It was such a plain answer that she didn't know what to do with it. "Do we have—" She hesitated. "Children?" "I have a daughter," he said. "From my first marriage. Clara. She's 7. She's been staying with my sister while I've been here." "How does she—" Sophia stopped again, unsure how to finish the question. "She knows something happened to you," Ethan said carefully. "She knows you're in the hospital. He exhaled slowly. "She's been asking about you every day." Sophia absorbed this. A 7-year-old girl who had apparently known her, who was apparently her stepdaughter, who was asking about her every day from somewhere across town. The ring felt heavier than it had a moment ago. "I don't know how to do this," she said. It came out more honest than she'd intended. "Neither do I," Ethan said. "But I've been thinking about it for 11 days, and I think the most honest thing I can tell you is that I'm not going to push you into anything. I'm not going to walk you through our history like a tour guide and expect you to feel things you don't feel. You're not—" He stopped, seemed to be choosing words carefully. "You're not obligated to me." "I'm wearing your ring." "Yes," he said. "But you didn't choose to wear it today. You chose to wear it 6 weeks ago. That's not the same thing." She looked at him for a long moment. He was serious. He wasn't performing this. There was no angle in his expression, no calculation, just a man sitting in a bad chair in a hospital room, telling a woman who didn't recognize him that she didn't owe him anything. Sophia Harper had grown up in a world where people with money wielded it. She'd had a landlord who raised her rent every February because he could. She'd watched the City Arts Foundation defund the community center 3 years running because nobody with resources cared enough to fight for it. She had spent her adult life watching what money did to the space between people. This man was worth, she didn't even know, hundreds of millions probably, maybe more. And he was sitting in a plastic hospital chair telling her she wasn't obligated. She didn't trust it, not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But she noted it. Chet, her mother drove up that evening. Patrice Harper was 58, with the same dark eyes as her daughter, and the particular no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had raised a child alone and hadn't had time to develop much patience for drama. She walked into room 214, set her overnight bag on the floor, wrapped Sophia in the kind of hug that feels like being a child again. and cried for exactly 90 seconds before pulling herself together. "You scared me half to death," she said against Sophia's hair. "I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for getting hit by a car." Patrice pulled back, held Sophia's face in both hands, and examined her the way she'd examined her knees after bicycle falls and her report cards after parent-teacher nights. "How are you? Really?" Sophia considered. "Confused. I'm really confused, Mama." Patrice sat on the edge of the bed and took her daughter's hand. The right one, not the ringed one, Sophia noticed, and her expression shifted into something more careful. "The doctor told me about the memory," Patrice said. "Did you know him?" Sophia asked. "Did you meet him before?" "Once," Patrice said. "He drove up to Macon to meet me. Brought Clara." She paused. "Sweet little girl. What did you think of him?" Patrice was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Her mother was not generally a woman who required time to form opinions. "I thought he was serious," Patrice said finally. "I thought he was serious about you." "But what does that mean? Serious how? Serious like a man who is—" "I thought," Patrice said carefully, "that he was scared of losing you even then, before all this." Sophia looked at the window. The lilies were white in the fading afternoon light. "Everyone keeps saying things like that," she said, "and I have no way to know if any of it is true." "I know. I don't remember him. I don't remember feeling anything about him. I don't remember— Mama, I teach piano at the Caldwell Center. He owns half the city. How does that make sense?" Patrice was quiet again. Then, "When you called me, when you first told me about him," she paused, "you sounded different." "Different how?" "Like someone who'd found something they weren't looking for," her mother said, "and wasn't sure yet if they were allowed to keep it." They discharged her on a Thursday. She'd spent 3 more days in the hospital, Dr. Ramirez wanting to run additional tests, wanting to monitor the healing, wanting to be cautious in the way that good doctors are cautious when brains are involved. She'd done occupational therapy and a cognition assessment and approximately 400 conversations that all circled back to the same territory. What she remembered, what she didn't, what to expect. What she remembered was everything before the missing window, her childhood in Macon, studying music at State, moving to this city 6 years ago because there was a position at the community center and she'd needed work, her apartment, her civic, her students. Diana, her best friend, who'd come to the hospital twice and sat on the bed and talked to her about nothing important because Sophia hadn't wanted to keep talking about the thing that was important. What she didn't remember was a specific 6 or 7 weeks, including, apparently, meeting a man, dating a man, deciding to marry a man, and doing so. The doctors couldn't tell her how to feel about this. Nobody could. Ethan arrived to take her home. She thought of it that way, and then caught herself because she wasn't sure it was home, because she wasn't sure what home was anymore. Driving a dark blue car himself, no driver, no assistant. He was in jeans and a gray pullover. He looked like someone making a deliberate effort to look like a normal person and only partially succeeding because he carried himself a particular way. A certain ease in the shoulders that either came from money or came from never having worried about money, and she couldn't entirely separate the two. Her discharge nurse, a woman named Terry, who had been practical and kind for 3 days, walked Sophia out to the curb and said goodbye with genuine warmth. Sophia got into the car. Ethan drove without filling the silence. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "I want you to know something," he said after about 10 minutes at a red light, looking straight ahead. "What?" "I've talked to my attorney. If at any point you want to, He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly. "If at any point the situation becomes something you don't want to be in, there are options. I'm not saying that to make a speech. I just want you to know that you have them." Sophia looked at his profile. "You're telling me you have a divorce attorney on standby," she said. "I'm telling you I have options in place for you," he said, "whatever form they need to take. Most men wouldn't say that. Most men wouldn't be in this situation." The light turned green. He drove. The house was— She hadn't expected it. Intellectually, she'd known. Billionaire, Kingston Properties, half the city. But somehow she'd been picturing a large house. A very large house. Not this. It was a property in the Westfield neighborhood, which she knew as the part of town where houses had gates and the ones you could see from the street had the particular well-kept quality of things that had been maintained for decades. The Kingston house was set back from the road, accessible through a gate that opened from the car on a long drive bordered by mature trees. The house itself was the kind of house that existed in a category beyond what she had vocabulary for. Stone and glass. 3 stories, wings, a porch that wrapped around the front and disappeared around the side. Gardens that were clearly tended by professionals. A fountain in the circular drive that was off for the season, filled with something that had probably been fall leaves and been cleaned up before her arrival. She stood on the driveway and looked at it. "I lived here," she said. "6 weeks," Ethan said from beside her. "We got married and then—" He paused. "And then the accident was 2 weeks later." So she'd lived here for 4 weeks before the crash. 4 weeks as a woman who had a 300-year-old farmhouse or whatever this was, and a husband she apparently loved, and a 7-year-old stepdaughter, and a life that looked nothing like the one she actually remembered. "Okay," she said, because there was no other word for it. He showed her around. It was careful and methodical. He pointed out rooms without narrating them, didn't tell her stories about things that would feel like ghost stories right now, didn't say this is where you used to or you told me once that. Just, this is the kitchen, this is the living room, this is the study. These are your rooms upstairs, and yes, the emphasis was clear. Your rooms, your suite, your space. No assumption of anything shared. Her rooms were in the east wing. A bedroom and a sitting room and a small bathroom. They were hers in the obvious way. Her clothes were there, hanging in the closet and folded in the drawers, her books on the shelves, her specific things, the things she recognized. And mixed among the expensive things, because some of the furnishings were clearly expensive, high thread count bedding and a lamp that was probably an antique, were the things from her life. Her old quilt from Macon, the one with the fraying corners she'd never repaired. The framed photo of her and Diana at Diana's college graduation. A mug from the community center that said Caldwell Music on the side in the slightly faded printing of something made on a tight budget. She stood in the bedroom and looked at her quilt on an expensive bed. "I brought things from your apartment," Ethan said from the doorway, where he'd stopped, not entering the room. When you moved in, you were specific about what you wanted." "The mug," she said. "You said you'd had it for 7 years." A very brief pause. "You said the coffee at the center always tasted better from that mug than from anything else. And you didn't see why marriage should change that." Something moved through her chest that she couldn't entirely name. "That sounds like something I would say," she admitted. He didn't smile exactly, but something changed slightly in the way he was holding his face. "Yes," he said. It did. Clara Kingston arrived 2 days later. Sophia had been anticipating this in the way you anticipate a thing that you have no framework for, something that might be fine and might be devastating, and no way to know which until it was happening. Ethan had warned her. Over breakfast, he cooked scrambled eggs and toast, no production about it, just someone who cooked. He'd said that Clara knew Sophia had been hurt and didn't remember some things, and that Clara was 7 and resilient, and also 7 and therefore unpredictable, and that Sophia should feel absolutely no pressure about any of it. "She might hug you immediately," he said, "or she might be shy. There's really no way to predict which mode she'll be in on any given morning." "What's she like?" Sophia asked. He considered this for a moment, which she was learning was how he operated. He didn't reach for the first available answer, he considered. "She's earnest," he said finally. "About everything. If she likes something, she likes it completely. If something bothers her, it really bothers her. She cried for 40 minutes last month because she thought we hadn't thanked the pizza delivery driver enough." Sophia looked at him. "She made me call the restaurant to make sure they passed along a compliment," he said, "and then she wrote a note anyway." Something warm moved through Sophia's chest and settled somewhere complicated. "She sounds like a handful," Sophia said. "Constantly," Ethan said. And for the first time since the hospital, he smiled. Not a polished smile, not a public-facing smile. Just a tired, genuine, helpless smile of a man who loved a difficult child and wouldn't trade it. Sophia looked away. She wasn't ready to deal with that smile yet. Mom. Clara arrived in the back of Ethan's sister's car. The sister was named Rachel, early 40s, appraising eyes that swept over Sophia in the driveway with the particular assessment of a woman deciding whether to be protective. And for a long moment after getting out of the car, she simply stood in the driveway and looked at Sophia. She was small for 7, dark-haired like her father, with her mother's coloring in some way that Sophia didn't know enough to identify. She had a backpack that was too big for her and a stuffed rabbit under one arm that had clearly been through many years of love and washing. She looked at Sophia. Sophia looked at her. "You don't remember me," Clara said. It was a statement, not a question. Matter of fact in the way children sometimes are when they've been given an honest explanation and have decided to work with it. "No," Sophia said. "I'm sorry." "Dad said it's not your fault." Clara seemed to be considering this information independently, checking it against her own assessment. Then, "Does it feel weird, not remembering?" "Very," Sophia said. "Do you remember anything about me?" "I don't, but your dad has told me some things." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Like what?" "Like that you made him call a pizza restaurant to make sure the driver got a compliment." Something changed in Clara's small face. A mix of vindication and embarrassment. "He deserved the compliment," she said. "He was out in the rain." "You were right," Sophia said. Clara looked at her for another long moment. Then she walked forward, stopped at a distance of about 3 feet, and said, with the gravity of someone making a formal declaration, "I know you don't remember, but you were teaching me to play piano. We were learning heart and soul together. It was going to take a while because I kept messing up the left-hand part." Sophia's throat tightened unexpectedly. "The left-hand part is always harder," she said, "but it gets easier." "You said that before," Clara said, in a tone that suggested this confirmed something she'd been waiting to verify. "Exactly that." Then she walked past Sophia into the house, rabbit under her arm, backpack bouncing, trailing a look back over one shoulder that was calculating in the way of children who are gathering information before deciding how to feel. Sophia stood on the driveway in the November cold and pressed her lips together and breathed. Rachel Kingston stepped up beside her. "She'll be okay," Rachel said. "Yeah," Sophia said. She wasn't talking about Clara. Woken. The days had a strange texture. She settled into routines that felt like someone else's routines that happened to fit. The coffee in the Caldwell mug every morning. The practice she'd started doing at the grand piano in Ethan's study because it was there, and she needed the playing more than she'd expected. The afternoons in the library off the main hall where she'd started reading everything she could find about memory and the brain and what it meant when pieces of your life were simply absent. Ethan moved around her carefully, not like a man walking on eggshells, more like a man who had made a deliberate decision about the radius he would keep and was maintaining it consistently. He was present without being intrusive. He ate meals with her, drove her to the 2 follow-up appointments at Dr. Ramirez's office, responded to her questions about the house and her schedule and their apparently brief history with a directness that she appreciated. But he didn't crowd her. He didn't seem to need anything from her that she wasn't giving. She found this more suspicious than she wanted to admit. "What do you do?" she asked him one evening. They were in the kitchen after dinner, and she was washing the pan he'd cooked in because he'd cooked, and it seemed equitable to wash, and he was drying things beside her. "More than I want to and less than I probably should," he said. "Kingston Properties is the biggest piece, but there's a foundation and a couple of smaller investments." "What kind of foundation?" "Urban arts and community space preservation." He was focused on a dish he was drying. "Mainly smaller organizations that can't get funding through traditional channels." Sophia stopped. She turned to look at him. "Urban arts," she said. "Yes." "Like the Caldwell Center?" His hands were still on the dish. "Among others." She turned back to the sink. She washed the pan. She was very deliberate about the angle of the sponge and the temperature of the water and the amount of soap. "Were you funding the center before we met?" she asked. A pause. "No," he said. The center wasn't one of the foundation's beneficiaries before. After we met then, he was quiet for a long moment. Sophia, I'm not making an accusation, she said, though even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure that was true. I just want to understand the facts. The facts are more complicated than a yes or no, he said. Then explain them. Another pause, longer. I was going to, he said, but I wanted you to have more time to... Ethan. She turned to face him. The pan was still in her hand. Explain them now. He set down the dish. He turned to face her, and he said, there is money involved. I arranged financial support for the Caldwell Center. I also arranged something for you personally. I want to explain the specifics because the specifics are what matter, and I want to explain them when you're ready to hear them, not just when I'm tired of not saying them. He wasn't evasive. He wasn't slippery. He met her eyes straight. I'm ready, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Not tonight, he said, but soon. I promise you soon. She didn't like it. She let it sit because something in her, some instinct she couldn't identify as new or old, told her that this particular man was not lying to her. Not the way she'd been lied to before. Not the comfortable, practiced lying of someone who did it easily. But that instinct was one she didn't entirely trust yet either, because the brain that instinct lived in was the same brain that had a 6-week hole in it, and she didn't know, she fundamentally did not know, whether the feelings she was developing were real or just the echo of feelings she'd had before that had survived the accident somehow. Like a song played so many times that your hands remembered it when your mind had forgotten everything else. At night, alone in her room with her old quilt and her Caldwell mug on the nightstand, she lay in the dark and played music in her head. Not anything complicated, just scales sometimes. The things you learn first, before pieces, before interpretation, before anything that required a particular kind of knowing, the left-hand part. She thought about a 7-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit and a strong sense of justice. She thought about a man who cooked scrambled eggs and maintained a careful radius. She thought, why would a poor woman like me marry a billionaire? She thought, what did I know that I don't know anymore? And she pressed her left hand flat against the quilt, felt the cold press of the ring against the others, and listened to the house settle in the dark. Big and old and full of someone else's history, and somehow, impossibly, inexplicably, starting to feel like something she might one day call hers. She didn't trust that feeling, but it was there, and she noted it the same way she'd noted everything since she woke up in room 214, carefully, without conclusion, the way you gather evidence when you know the full picture is still missing and you cannot afford, not yet, to be wrong. The second week at the estate, Sophia found the notes. Not love notes? Nothing like that. They were practical things, tucked in the kinds of places you'd only find them if you were living in a space the way you live in your own space, not the way you live in someone else's. The first one was in the drawer of the nightstand, folded twice, written in her own handwriting on the back of what appeared to be a grocery receipt. It said, "The piano in the study has a sticky C-sharp. Don't let it frustrate you. It was like that when he bought the house. He says he keeps meaning to have it fixed. He won't. It'll be a whole thing." She sat on the edge of the bed and read it 3 times. She'd written it to herself. She must have... The handwriting was hers. The voice was hers. That dry side note quality that Diana always said was her best and worst quality, depending on the situation. Somewhere in the week she couldn't remember, she'd written herself a note about a piano with a sticky key and a husband who had maintenance avoidance issues, and she'd left it in the nightstand like a message in a bottle to a future self she hadn't known she'd need. The C-sharp on the study piano was, in fact, sticky. She'd noticed it the first morning and worked around it the way pianists always work around a bad key. Slightly, unconsciously, because the ear corrects before the hands even process the problem. She'd been married to this man for 4 weeks before the accident. She'd been here long enough to know the piano's quirks. She'd been here long enough to write a note to herself about it. She folded the receipt back the way she'd found it and sat with it in her lap for a while. Over the next few days, she started looking. Not in an obsessive way, not tearing through drawers and closets, just paying attention the way she paid attention to everything now, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. And the notes kept appearing. One on the mirror in the bathroom, a reminder in her own hand about a specific brand of shampoo that was apparently available at a pharmacy 3 blocks from the community center. One tucked inside the cover of a novel on the bedroom shelf, saying only, "This one's good. You'll want to finish it. You won't have time to finish it. Finish it anyway." One on a sticky note attached to the back of the Caldwell mug. She hadn't seen it until she turned the mug all the way around. That said, "He doesn't take sugar in his coffee, but he makes it sweet for you without making it a thing." Notice that. That one she held for a very long time. He makes it sweet for you without making it a thing. She went downstairs that morning with the specific intention of watching. Ethan was already in the kitchen, which was usually how mornings went. He was an early riser in the particular way of people who had been managing large things for a long time and couldn't sleep past 6 regardless of the circumstances. He had his own coffee, black, sitting beside him as he read something on his phone. And when she walked in and reached for her mug and put it in position under the coffee maker, he stood up without looking away from his phone, opened the cabinet where the sugar was kept, and set it on the counter beside her elbow. Not with ceremony, not as a pointed gesture, just, there it is. The way you put a thing where someone needs it when putting it there costs you nothing, and you've done it enough times that it's no longer a decision. He sat back down. He kept reading. Sophia made her coffee, added sugar, and looked at the back of his head. Notice that. She had noticed it. The version of herself who'd written that note had noticed it too, had apparently thought it worth writing down, worth preserving across whatever gap she'd sensed was possible between herself and her own future. She'd been documenting him. Little things. The specific texture of what it was like to live alongside this person. She sat down across the table from him with her coffee. He glanced up briefly. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Better than the first week," she said. He nodded and went back to his phone. It was comfortable. That was the thing that unsettled her more than almost anything else. It was comfortable in the way that takes time. The kind of comfortable that you can't manufacture in a few days of proximity, that only comes from enough accumulated mornings that you stop performing ease and just have it. She didn't know how they'd built it. She hadn't been there for the building, but she was living in it now, and it fit around her like something that had been made to her specific measurements. She didn't know what to do with that. Diana came on a Saturday, arriving at the gate in her ancient Subaru with a bag of pastries from the bakery on 9th that Sophia loved, had always loved, the kind of love that predated any missing memories, and a look on her face that said she had opinions she was holding in reserve until she could read the room. Diana Chen was 31, a librarian in the way that made people who thought librarians were quiet deeply confused upon meeting her. She was loud in the best way, sharp, and had been Sophia's closest friend since they'd met at a mutual friend's birthday party 6 years ago and discovered they were both pretending to enjoy a conversation about cryptocurrency. She had held Sophia's hand through 2 bad relationships, one terrible job offer, the death of Sophia's father 3 years ago, and, apparently, a wedding she hadn't seen coming either. They sat in the kitchen with the pastries between them, and for a while they just ate, which was how they always operated. Food first. Conversation after. Some rituals survived everything. "Okay," Diana said finally, brushing powdered sugar off her jacket. "Tell me what's going on in your head." "I don't know," Sophia said. "That's not an answer." "I know." Sophia turned her coffee mug in her hands. "It's the honest one." Diana looked at her steadily. "Are you okay? Like, actually, not hospital discharge okay?" "I don't know that either." Sophia looked at the table. "I keep finding things. Notes I left myself, small stuff, evidence of a life I lived for 6 weeks that I have absolutely no access to." "What kind of notes?" Sophia told her about the nightstand note, the one about the piano. She told her about the one on the mug. Diana was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like you." "That's the problem. Everything sounds like me. Everything fits like me. My clothes are still my clothes. My books are still my books. My habits are apparently still my habits. But I'm in this house worth, I don't even know how much, married to a man I've known for less than 2 weeks from my perspective, and everyone keeps looking at me like they're waiting for me to remember that this is right." She stopped. "And I can't remember. And some days it almost feels right anyway, which scares me more than anything else." Diana picked at the edge of her pastry. "What does he do? When you're having a bad day?"
Sophia thought about this. Nothing dramatic, she paused. He gives me space.
He doesn't hover. He doesn't make me feel like I owe him a particular reaction. He cooks. He makes sure I have coffee. He showed Clara and me how to do this thing. She stopped because she'd almost smiled, and she wasn't ready to examine that. What thing? We were in the living room 2 nights ago, and Clara was having a meltdown about a homework assignment, and he just sat on the floor with her, and they worked through it together on the floor with pencils and loose paper like it was completely normal. And at some point I sat down on the floor too, without thinking about it, and we were all 3 just on the floor doing this math problem about fractions. And She shook her head. It felt like something I don't have the right context for. Diana looked at her for a long moment. He sounds like a decent person, she said carefully. I know. That's a good thing. I know. Sophia looked at her. But Diana, the amount of money this man has is not real. It's not a normal amount of money. And everyone on the outside, every tabloid, I've seen how people look at me when I go out. I've seen the way Ethan's assistant looked at me the one time she came to the house. Like they're waiting to figure out what angle I'm working. You're not working an angle. I know I'm not. But I also don't know what the woman who married him was thinking, and I can't ask her. She's gone. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. The woman who decided this was a good idea is gone. I'm living in the decision she made, and I can't verify it. Diana was quiet for a while. Outside, through the kitchen window, a crow landed on the garden wall and regarded the world with the specific impassiveness of birds. Can I tell you something? Diana said. Yeah. When you called me, when you first told me about him, I asked you if you were sure. I probably asked you 3 times. You were annoyed with me. A pause. You said, exactly, because I wrote it down. I don't know why I wrote it down. I just did. You said, he's the first person who's ever given me a reason to trust something without needing me to be grateful for it. Diana looked at her. I didn't totally understand what you meant, but I could tell you meant it. Sophia sat with that sentence. He's the first person who's ever given me a reason to trust something without needing me to be grateful for it. She knew what it meant. Even now, with the context gone, she understood the shape of it. Because she'd spent her adult life in situations where the help that was offered came with the implicit expectation of gratitude, deference, the soft currency of owing someone. Her landlord. The Arts Foundation committees who funded and defunded the center on a whim and expected appreciation either way. Even some of the well-meaning people who'd offered her things over the years. The older colleagues who'd mentored her with the unspoken understanding that she would always remember who'd helped her up. She understood what it would have meant to find someone who didn't operate that way. She just wished she could remember finding him. The note about the coffee was pinned to the inside of her brain now. He doesn't take sugar in his coffee, but he makes it sweet for you without making it a thing. Notice that. She'd noticed it. She was noticing it. She just didn't know yet what to do with the noticing. After Diana left, Sophia went to the study and sat at the piano and played for an hour, working around the sticky C-sharp the way her past self had told her to, and thought about a woman she used to be who had been paying attention to small things and documenting them, building a case for herself about a man she'd apparently decided to trust. That woman had known something. Sophia just had to figure out if she still believed it. The tabloids found her in the 3rd week. She'd known it was coming. Rachel had warned her, in the oblique way of someone who knows the information is going to be unpleasant and is trying to soften it without being dishonest. There had been coverage of the accident, brief, factual, the kind of thing that happened when a man of Ethan's profile was involved in any sort of news event. Sophia Harper, 30, music teacher. Serious injury, recovering. The details had been kept vague because Ethan had apparently instructed his PR person, a composed woman named Mira, to keep them vague. But people talk. Staff talk, or someone at the hospital talks, or a neighbor's gardener mentions something to someone. And by the time Sophia walked outside on a cold Tuesday morning for what had been a perfectly private walk around the block, there were 2 photographers on the sidewalk across the street. She stopped. They raised their cameras. She was wearing jeans, a heavy coat, a scarf that had been on a hook by the front door and which she was almost certain was hers. She hadn't put on makeup. She'd been going for a walk, just a walk, because Dr. Ramirez had said fresh air and light movement, and because the house had felt smaller than usual that morning. She turned around and went back inside. Ethan found her in the front hallway, still in her coat. He took one look at her face and said, "How many?" "2, across the street." He exhaled. Not dramatically, just the exhale of a man who'd been dealing with this particular category of intrusion for long enough that it no longer surprised him, just tired him. "I'm sorry," he said. "Mira has been trying to—" "I'm not angry," Sophia said. "I just wasn't ready." She paused. "Is this going to be a lot? The coverage?" He was honest, which she'd come to expect. "Probably for a while. You're—" a pause. "You're not what people expected me to marry." "A poor music teacher." "Someone real," he said quietly. "Most of the women in the circles I move in professionally are—" He paused. "They're from a specific world. You're not. People have opinions about that." "What kind of opinions?" He met her eyes. "The kind that assume a motive." "That I married you for money." "Yes." She held his gaze. "And what do you say when people assume that?" "I don't respond to it," he said, "because the people who matter know better, and the people who don't matter aren't going to be convinced by anything I say." He paused. "But I know it's harder when you're the one it's about." It was harder. That was the particular cruelty of it, the narrative that existed about her out there in the world, the version of Sophia Harper who had calculatingly attached herself to a wealthy man, was the version most people would see first and believe longest. And she couldn't even refute it with the full truth, because the full truth was inside a 6-week window she didn't have access to. She couldn't say, "This is why I chose him." She couldn't access the why. All she could do was live in the choice and try to figure out whether she could believe in it. Mira came that afternoon, which was the first time Sophia had a real conversation with her. She was precise in the way of people who've built a career out of controlling narratives, which Sophia recognized immediately. And she was professional in the way that could tip either toward genuine respect or toward barely managed assessment, depending on the day. They sat in the front sitting room, which felt like the most formal room in the house, and Mira laid out what she called the situation: coverage, angles, the specific publications that would be pursuing the story, and what could be managed and what couldn't. "We have 2 options," Mira said. "Silence, which is defensible but leaves the narrative open for others to fill, or a limited statement that acknowledges you're recovering and redirects attention." "What kind of statement?" Sophia asked. "Something factual and non-specific, something that acknowledges the marriage without inviting questions about your memory." Mira paused. "Ethan has been handling press for 15 years. He understands the mechanics of this, but ultimately, decisions about your story are yours." Sophia noticed that. Decisions about your story are yours. She wondered if Ethan had told Mira to frame it that way, or if Mira had arrived at it herself. "What does Ethan think?" she asked. Mira looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral, but contained somewhere underneath a flicker of surprise. "He thinks whatever protects your privacy and your comfort is the right approach. He said, and I'm quoting, that it's your face and your life, and he has no business making decisions for you." Something in Sophia's chest shifted. She chose silence for now. Later that evening, she found herself in the doorway of Clara's room, which she didn't entirely plan. She'd been heading past in the hallway on the way to her own room, and the door had been partly open, and the sound coming through it was the halting, patient sound of someone learning something difficult. Clara was at a small keyboard on her desk, a Casio, the kind of keyboard that was a very long step down from the grand piano downstairs, chosen presumably because it was Clara-sized and Clara-level, and she was working through something that Sophia recognized after a moment as the right-hand line of heart and soul. She was getting it wrong in the way beginners always get it wrong, slightly rushed on the 3rd note, landing the 4th note a fraction too hard, compensating for the rush with a pause that broke the rhythm. Over and over, with the particular focused frustration of someone who knew what it was supposed to sound like and was deeply annoyed at the distance between that and what their hands were producing. Sophia stood in the hallway and did not say anything. She watched Clara play the wrong version 4 more times, then 5. Her small jaw set, rabbit pushed to the edge of the desk to make room for her elbows. Then she sat back with a sound that was almost a growl. The pause is the problem, Sophia said. Clara spun around on her chair. You're overcompensating after the rush, Sophia said, moving into the room without entirely deciding to. You know you're rushing the third note, so you make yourself wait on the fourth, but that makes it choppy. The fix isn't slowing down on 4. The fix is slowing down on 3. Clara looked at her. Can I? Sophia gestured at the keyboard. Clara scooted sideways on the chair, making room. Sophia sat on the edge of the desk chair beside her, which was not a particularly comfortable arrangement, and played the line slowly. Once, then again, then a third time at slightly increased speed. See what's happening on 3? She said. Clara leaned in, watching her right hand. Play it with me, Sophia said. Your right hand on mine. It was a teaching technique she'd used for years, letting the student feel the weight and timing of someone else's hand through physical contact, learning pace through touch rather than instruction. Clara put her small hand on top of Sophia's, and they played the line together, slowly, Clara's fingers resting lightly on Sophia's and following without pressing. They did it 4 times. Now you, Sophia said. Clara played it alone. It wasn't perfect. The third note was still slightly tentative, overcorrected in a new direction now. But the pause was gone. The rhythm was intact. Clara played it again. Better. She looked at Sophia with the specific expression of a child who has achieved something and wants credit, but is also trying not to be obvious about wanting credit. Better, Sophia confirmed. I knew you'd remember how to teach, Clara said, even if you don't remember other stuff. Sophia looked at her. You told me once that your hands remember things even when your brain forgets, Clara said, with the precision of a child quoting something they've decided to believe. You were talking about a song, but I think it probably works for other things too. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Where'd you get that rabbit? She asked. Clara looked down at the stuffed rabbit she'd pulled back into her lap. My mom, she said, matter of fact. Before she died. His name is Edmund. How old were you? 3. Then, I don't really remember her. The simplicity of it hit somewhere Sophia hadn't been prepared for. Not because it was sad in the way sentimentalized things are sad, but because it was just true. Stated with the flat practicality of a child who had grown up with a fact and incorporated it into the world as the world simply was. Clara didn't remember her mother. Sophia didn't remember the last 6 weeks. They were, in their different ways, both working with incomplete information. Edmund's a good name for a rabbit, Sophia said. I know, said Clara. Sophia stayed for another half hour, working through the left-hand line of heart and soul, with Clara in the methodical, unglamorous way that teaching actually worked. Repetition, correction, repetition, small improvement, backslide, correction again. When she left, Clara was still playing. The rhythm steadier now, the 2 hands not yet together but moving toward each other. In the hallway, she almost walked directly into Ethan. He'd clearly been there for a few minutes. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed loosely, and from the position he'd been able to see and hear everything through the partially open door. He straightened up when she came out. They looked at each other in the dim hallway light. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. I know, she said. He looked at her with something in his expression that was too complicated to name quickly. She looked back and then looked away, because complicated was more than she was ready for in a dim hallway at 9:15 on a Thursday night. Good night, she said. Good night, Sophia. She walked down the hall to her room. She did not look back, but she was aware, with a clarity that irritated her, of the space where he'd been standing and of how it had felt to walk out of that room and find him there, not watching, not listening in the intrusive sense, just present, the way he was always present, at the exact radius he'd chosen and maintained. She lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling and thought, this is what she saw. The woman I used to be. This is what she was paying attention to. The question was not whether she could see it. She could see it. She'd been seeing it for weeks now, note by note, and morning by morning, and small, careful gesture by small, careful gesture. The question was whether seeing it was enough, whether understanding why someone might have loved him was the same as loving him, whether you could arrive at a feeling through reconstruction, The way you could reconstruct a piece of music from its score, even if you'd never heard it played before. Technical and accurate and correct in every measurable way, but missing whatever quality it was that made it real. She didn't know. She wasn't going to know tonight. She closed her eyes. The sticky C-sharp was in the back of her mind, and Clara's small hand over hers, and the sugar already on the counter when she'd reached for her mug this morning. She'd never been a woman who made decisions quickly. She made them thoroughly, with attention and evidence. Her past self had apparently done the same. She was just going to have to trust that process, even if it had to start over from nothing. It was 3 weeks after her discharge from the hospital that she went back to the Caldwell Center for the first time. She told Ethan she was going, and he didn't ask to come with her, just asked if she wanted him to drive her, or if she'd prefer to take his car herself. She said she'd call a cab, which was not the most logical answer in the context of having a car and a driver available, but was the answer that felt right, the answer that felt like her, the version of her who had lived the life she actually remembered. The cab let her out on Caldwell Avenue, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building. The Caldwell Community Music Center was not a beautiful building. It was a former bank from the 1940s that had been repurposed in the 70s and repurposed again in the 90s, and had not been significantly renovated since, which meant it had excellent bones and questionable HVAC, and the specific architectural dignity of a thing that had served too many purposes to look definitive about any of them. The signage above the door had the slightly sun-faded quality of signage that had been there for years and would probably be there for years more, because replacing it cost money the center didn't have. She stood outside and felt something she had not felt in the estate, for all its size and comfort. She felt like herself. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The smell hit her immediately, carpet and rosin and chalk dust, and the particular quality of a room that runs old radiators in November. She stood in the small entryway and breathed it in and felt the specific pang of something so familiar it hurts. The way your childhood home smells when you've been away for a long time. "Miss Sophia?" The voice came from the reception desk, and the face behind it was Marcus Williams, not her student, but Marcus's mother, Denise, who volunteered at the front desk 3 afternoons a week. Denise was 42 and had the particular energy of a woman who ran multiple operations simultaneously and made it look normal, and right now she was standing up from behind the desk with her hand to her mouth. "Hi, Denise," Sophia said. "They told me you were out of the hospital, but I didn't—" Denise came around the desk and hugged her, the kind of hug that required squeezing back. "Lord, we were worried. Marcus has been asking about you every day." "I heard piano doesn't stop just because the teacher's in the hospital." Denise laughed. "His father has been doing YouTube tutorials, not the same." She pulled back and looked at Sophia with the frank concern of someone who cared and didn't bother hiding it. "Are you okay? Really okay?" "Getting there," Sophia said. "I wanted to see the place." She walked through the center, through the entryway, and into the main corridor where the practice rooms ran along both sides. Most of them were occupied. She could hear piano through one door, guitar through another, a recorder somewhere that was very clearly a beginner recorder, sharp and tentative. The bulletin boards were covered with flyers for the winter recital, which was apparently scheduled for the week before the new year. She stopped at the door of practice room 4, the one where she taught. The one she thought of as hers in the particular way you think of a room as yours when you've spent enough hours in it. Through the small window in the door, she could see a substitute instructor with a student she recognized, a 12-year-old named Priya, who had been her student for 2 years and was working on something Sophia couldn't quite make out from the angle, but that looked like it might be a Chopin piece, which was slightly ambitious for where Priya had been when Sophia last worked with her. She watched through the window. She became aware that someone was standing beside her. "I thought that was your cab," said a voice. She turned. James Whitfield, the center's director, was standing in the corridor with a coffee mug and the expression of a man who had been hoping she would show up and was doing his best not to show how much he'd been hoping. He was 63, had run the Caldwell Center for 20 years, and had the particular look of a man who had spent 2 decades fighting for a thing he believed in and was tired in all the places you get tired from that kind of fight. "James," she said. "Come sit down," he said. "I just made terrible coffee. The machine's been acting up again." His office was at the end of the hall, small and overfull in the specific way of a director who had been in the same office for 20 years. Plaques and photos and piles of papers and a filing system that made sense only to him. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and he poured her coffee from a machine that was, as advertised, clearly having a bad day based on the coffee's texture. She added enough sugar to compensate. "How are you?" he asked. "I keep getting asked that." "Because people care about the answer." He studied her over his mug. "The memory thing. It's real?" "Very." He nodded slowly. "Strange territory." "You could say that." She looked around the office. The photo of last year's winter recital was on the wall behind him. She could pick out her students in it: Marcus, Priya, old Mr. Okafor, who'd taken up piano at 61 because he'd always meant to. She was in the photo too, standing at the edge of the group, slightly turned, like she'd been saying something to someone just out of frame. "James?" she said. "The center's funding situation." Something careful came into his expression. "What about it?" "How is it?" He set down his mug. "Better than it was, as of about 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks ago. The timing was exact, and she'd known it would be. James looked at her steadily. "You know about that." "Ethan mentioned there was money involved. He hasn't explained all of it yet." She paused. "I thought I'd ask you directly what happened." James was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall, choosing his words. "An attorney contacted us," he said, "about 8 weeks ago, acting on behalf of a private foundation. They offered a multi-year funding arrangement, operating costs, equipment, staff salaries, facility maintenance. Significant. The kind of thing we've been applying for and not getting for a decade." He paused. The terms were unconditional. No naming rights, no programming requirements, no board seats, just money, with the agreement that the center continued operating as it has been. "Did you know it was Ethan's foundation?" "Not immediately. The attorney was discreet. I figured it out eventually." He met her eyes. "I want to be honest with you, Sophia, because you're owed honesty. I don't know the full context of why this particular foundation funded us at this particular time. I know that you married a man with significant resources shortly after we received the funding, and I know that you've been a cornerstone of this place for 4 years. He paused. "I thought about turning it down." "But you didn't." "The furnace in the basement has been operating past its life expectancy for 3 years, he said. "I have 2 instructors whose salaries I've been supplementing with my own money because the grant situation has been a disaster. I have 40 kids who come here every week because they don't have anywhere else." He paused. "I thought about it, but I'm not able to turn down the thing these kids need because the context makes me uncomfortable." Sophia nodded slowly. "I'm not angry at you," James said, "in case that's what you're trying to determine." "I'm trying to determine what I think about it myself," she said honestly. "And?" "I don't know yet." She walked home. It was cold and it was a long walk, 45 minutes, maybe more. And she hadn't told Ethan she was going to walk, so he was probably going to get a notification from the car service that she'd never been picked up and wonder where she was. She didn't care. She needed the cold and the length of it, needed the physical time to move through it. She thought about what James had said. Unconditional. No naming rights, no programming requirements, no board seats. Just the money, with no strings she could see, flowing to a place she loved from a man she was married to. She turned it over the whole walk home. When she arrived at the gate and punched in the code, she knew the code, had known it without thinking the first time she'd needed it. Another piece of implicit memory surviving where explicit memory had failed, the house was lit in the early evening, warm through the windows. Ethan opened the front door before she reached it. He looked at her with the contained expression of someone who had been moderately worried and was managing it. "You walked?" he said. "I needed to." He stepped back to let her in. "Cold?" "Yes." She moved past him into the hallway, unwinding the scarf. "I'll make dinner," he said, because that was what he did, because he was a man who expressed care through the provision of practical things and did it without making it a production. She stopped in the hallway and turned to look at him. "Tomorrow," she said. "You said you'd explain. About the money, about the center. You said soon, and it's been almost 2 weeks." He looked at her steadily. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She held his gaze a moment longer, looking for something evasive, something that would give her a reason to be suspicious, looking for the angle she'd been looking for since she woke up in room 214 and found a ring on her finger and a stranger beside her bed. She'd been looking for it for weeks. She didn't find it. What she found instead was a man who looked tired and honest and somewhat braced for a conversation he'd been carrying for a while, waiting for the right moment to set it down. She went upstairs to change. The sticky C-sharp waited in the study downstairs, and tomorrow waited after tonight, and the cold from the walk was still in her hands. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the ring. I don't know what you knew, she thought, to the woman who'd put it on. But I'm starting to understand why you might have believed him. It wasn't certainty. It was a long way from certainty. But it was the first thing in all the weeks since the accident that felt like the beginning of one. Tomorrow came the way tomorrows always come, when you've been dreading and needing something in equal measure. Too fast and not fast enough, arriving before she'd fully decided how to hold herself for it. Ethan made breakfast. He always made breakfast. Scrambled eggs again, which she'd learned was not because he lacked range, but because scrambled eggs were the thing Clara would reliably eat on school mornings without negotiation, and the absence of negotiation at 7:15 a.m. was worth the repetition. Clara ate her eggs and talked about a disagreement with a girl in her class named Penelope with the specific moral intensity of a 7-year-old who had determined that justice was not being served, and Ethan listened and asked 3 careful questions and managed not to take a side, which Sophia had observed was his consistent approach to Clara's social conflicts. Not dismissive, not escalating, just present and listening and trusting Clara to work toward her own conclusions. Clara left for school in a flurry of backpack and Edmund the rabbit, and a very specific complaint about her shoelaces, and then it was just the 2 of them, and the remains of breakfast, and the thing that had been waiting since last night. Sophia wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Okay, she said. Ethan pushed his plate aside. He'd barely eaten. She'd noticed. Before I explain the specifics, he said, I need you to understand something about how I operate. How I've always operated. It's not a defense, it's context. Because without it, what I'm about to tell you sounds like something it isn't. Tell me the context then. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. When I was 26, he said, my father gave me control of Kingston Properties. Not because I'd earned it in any meaningful sense, because I was his son, and it was the next thing that happened. I had money I hadn't worked for, influence I hadn't built, and a network of people who were kind to me almost entirely because of what I represented. He paused. My wife, Clara's mother, her name was Vivienne. We met when I was 28. She was from a similar world. Old family money, the right schools, the right last name. And she loved me. I believe that. I still believe that. But when things got hard, when I was difficult, which I was, regularly, she didn't have the option of leaving easily. Her family had financial entanglements with mine. Her social world was my social world. She was contained by the circumstances. And I didn't see it clearly until much later. Sophia watched him. She died when Clara was 3, he said. A pulmonary embolism, very fast, no warning. And after, when I was trying to understand what our marriage had actually been, one of the things I kept coming back to was that I'd never known, I couldn't know, how many of her choices had been genuinely free ones. Whether she'd stayed in difficult moments because she wanted to, or because she didn't have a real alternative. He looked up. That's not a criticism of her. It's a criticism of the structure. The structure I'd grown up in and never questioned. Sophia waited. When I met you, he said, it was different from anything I'd experienced in my adult life. You didn't need anything from me. You had a life, a whole specific life, and I was not part of it, and you were not remotely interested in becoming part of mine. You were at a fundraiser for urban arts organizations. Rachel dragged you, apparently, because your director was supposed to come and canceled at the last minute and you owed Rachel a favor, which I only know because you told me later and you were annoyed about it, even in retrospect. Something moved across his face. You spent 40 minutes arguing with a man from the City Arts Foundation about defunding policy, and you were not at all interested in the fact that I was in the room. Despite everything, something pulled at the corner of Sophia's mouth.
I believe that, she said. I asked you for your number and you said you'd think about it, he said, which I am reasonably certain no one has said to me since I was 19 years old. The trace of something wry moved through his expression and faded. I thought about you for 2 weeks before you called, and when things moved, when they moved fast, which they did, faster than either of us expected, I became afraid. Of what? Of the same thing, he said, of not knowing whether you were choosing freely, whether the money would become, whether at some point I'd look back and not be able to tell the difference between genuine feeling and the gravitational pull of security. He looked at her directly. I've seen what that does. To people, to relationships. I didn't want that for you. I especially didn't want that for you. Sophia set down her mug. So, Ethan said, before I proposed, I talked to my attorneys. I set up 2 things. The first was a personal financial arrangement for you, an irrevocable trust, independent of me and of Kingston Properties, that provided you with resources sufficient to maintain your life as it was. Your apartment, your car, your costs. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would change your life, just a floor, stability, so that nothing about your decision would be influenced by fear of financial instability. Sophia was very still. The second was the Caldwell Center funding, he said. Same structure, irrevocable, through the foundation, no conditions attached to our marriage or our relationship. The center would receive that funding, whether we married, whether we stayed married, whether you left me the next day. I had no control over it once it was established. Neither did my company, my attorneys, or anyone connected to me operationally. The kitchen was quiet. A car passed on the street outside. The refrigerator made the small mechanical sound refrigerators make. Both arrangements were finalized before I proposed, Ethan said. I told you about them the day before the wedding. I wanted you to know, I needed you to know, that nothing you decided would leave you worse off than when we met. Not financially, not professionally. You were not choosing between marrying me and struggling. You were choosing between marrying me and being fine. Entirely fine, independently fine, without me. Sophia pressed her hands flat on the table. I need to see it, she said. I know. I have the documents. He stood, and she heard him moving through the hallway toward the study. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the rings on her finger and tried to locate her breath, which felt like it had gone somewhere in the last 5 minutes. He came back with a folder. Thick, legal-weight paper, the specific look of documents that have been prepared by people who are paid considerable amounts of money to prepare documents. He set it on the table in front of her and sat back down. She opened it. The language was dense, the way legal language is always dense. But she was not a stupid woman, and she had the particular tenacity of someone who had spent years navigating arts funding applications, which require the same quality of reading, careful, suspicious, looking for what the words were actually doing underneath what they appeared to say. She read slowly. She turned pages. She went back twice to sections she wanted to be sure of. Irrevocable trust, administered by an independent fiduciary. Neither Ethan Kingston nor any entity connected to Kingston Properties held any authority to modify, redirect, or terminate the arrangements. The funding to the Caldwell Center, the personal financial provision, both established and finalized on a specific date. She checked the date. 3 days before their wedding. She closed the folder. She stood up from the table and walked out of the kitchen. She made it to the hallway before she stopped, because she didn't know where she was going. Not upstairs, not outside, not anywhere specific. She just needed to be out of the room where he was sitting with his careful, honest face and his dense legal documents and the explanation that she'd asked for and had finally received. She stood in the hallway and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and tried to think clearly. He'd set up money for her before he proposed. He'd funded the center before the wedding, both irrevocable, both independent of her decision, both documented and finalized and legally beyond his control before she'd said yes to anything. She understood what he'd intended. She understood the logic of it, the reasoning he'd given, the specific fear he was trying to address. She had heard every word of it. What she could not get past, standing in the hallway of a house that didn't feel like hers on a morning when everything had shifted again, was this. She didn't remember saying yes.
She didn't remember being told about the documents the day before the wedding. She didn't remember what she'd felt when she found out. She didn't know whether the woman who'd heard this explanation had been reassured by it or troubled by it, or somewhere in the complicated middle territory where Sophia was standing right now. And she realized, with a cold clarity that arrived without warning, the kind of clarity that you don't seek and can't unhave once it arrives, that she had no way of knowing whether the marriage had been a genuine choice, not because the money had coerced her, but because she'd known about the money, because the money had existed, because no matter how irrevocably independent the trusts were, the knowledge of them had been part of the air she was breathing when she made the decision. The people who assume a motive, Ethan had said about the tabloids, they assume a motive. She had told herself for weeks that the motive wasn't there, that she wasn't that woman, that her past self hadn't been that woman, that what she was seeing in the accumulated evidence of their 6 weeks together was something real and not convenient. But the money had been there before the wedding. The security had been established before she said yes. And she couldn't remember saying yes. She couldn't remember what it had felt like to make a free choice when the safety net was already in place. She couldn't remember whether the net had mattered to her when she stepped off the edge. She heard him stand up from the kitchen table. She heard him come to the doorway. "Sophia." "I need a minute," she said. Her voice was strange, too flat. He stopped. She turned to face him. She needed to see his face for what she was about to say, needed to see whether there was anything in it that would change what she was thinking. There wasn't. He looked like a man waiting for something he'd been afraid of and hadn't been able to prevent. "You set up money for me before you proposed," she said. "Yes." "And then you proposed." "Yes." "And I knew about the money when I said yes." "Yes." "I told you the day before." "So I knew," she said, "that if I married you, I would never have to worry about money again. And I knew that even if it didn't work out, the center would be funded and I would be financially stable." He was very still. "That's not," he started. "I know what you intended," she said. "I heard everything you said. I understand the logic." She stopped, pressing through the thickness in her chest. "But Ethan, I don't remember making the choice. I have no access to what I felt or what I was thinking, or whether the money mattered to me or not. I can't verify my own decision. And I'm standing here looking at legal documents that say you arranged significant financial security for me before you asked me to marry you. And I have a 6-week hole in my memory where the choosing happened. And She stopped. He didn't move. He was watching her with an expression that was terrible in its openness. No defense, no argument ready, just a man absorbing something that was hurting him and not trying to make it stop. "I don't know if I chose you," she said, "or if I chose the floor you built first." The words sat between them in the hallway. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for a counter, yet. He just stood there and let it be there, the things she'd said, and the silence after it was the specific silence of something that couldn't be taken back, and both of them knew it. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it, because she was sorry. Not for saying it, because it was true and she'd needed to say it, but for the fact that it was true, for the fact that they were here, for all of it. "I know," he said quietly. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Then she called Diana. Diana picked up on the second ring, which was always how Diana answered calls from Sophia. Fast, like she'd been waiting. "What happened?" Diana said immediately. Sophia told her, all of it, the documents, the trusts, the dates, the irrevocability, Ethan's explanation. She told it straight and fast, no editorializing, just the facts. When she finished, Diana was quiet for a moment. "Okay," Diana said. "Okay? I'm thinking." A pause. "Can I say something that might be annoying? When do you not?" What he described, the irrevocable thing, the independence of the trusts, that's actually the opposite of buying you, Diana said carefully. Like, structurally. If he wanted to use money to control you, he would have kept control of the money. He gave it away before you said yes. "I know that's the argument," Sophia said. "I heard it from him. But I don't know what I felt when I found out." Her voice cracked slightly, and she hated it. "Diana, I don't know what I felt. I can reconstruct the logic. I can understand why someone might be reassured by it. But I can't. I can't access the actual feeling I had when he told me. I can't know if I was relieved or uncomfortable, or whether it changed anything about my decision. It's gone. And without it, I'm left with the fact that a billionaire set up financial security for me before he asked me to marry him, and I said yes, and I can't verify what any of that meant. Diana was quiet again. Longer this time. "What are you going to do?" she said finally. Sophia looked at the ring. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know how to stay here without knowing, and I don't know how to leave without knowing either. I'm stuck in the middle of something I can't see all the way around." She stayed in her room for the rest of the morning. At some point, Ethan knocked on her door quietly and said through it that he was picking Claire up from school and that there was food in the kitchen and he'd be back by 4. He didn't ask to come in. She heard his footsteps move away down the hall. She sat at the small desk in the corner of the room where she'd set up a space for herself in the first weeks. Her books, her notebook, the specific organized chaos of a person making a space their own. And she opened the notebook and tried to write. She couldn't. She tried to read. She couldn't do that either. She went to the piano instead because the piano was the one reliable thing, the one place where her brain stopped narrating itself and just worked. She sat at the grand in the study and played without thinking about what to play. Scales at first, then pieces that came to her hands without being summoned, Chopin, then something of her own she'd written years ago, then nothing organized, just movement and sound and the specific therapy of translation, the thing that couldn't be said in words becoming something that didn't need to be. She played through the sticky C-sharp without thinking about it. She played for an hour and a half. When she stopped, she felt marginally more capable of thinking straight, which was usually the outcome. She sat on the bench and looked at the keys and acknowledged, honestly, to herself. She was scared. Not of Ethan specifically. Of the specific impossibility of her situation, which was that she was being asked to evaluate a marriage she couldn't remember making, using only the evidence that had survived the accident plus the 30 years of herself that had preceded it. She thought about what she actually knew. She knew she was not a reckless person. She'd moved to a new city on a modest salary with no safety net and built a life there over 6 years through caution and consistency and not making decisions she couldn't justify. She knew she was not easily impressed by money. She'd grown up without much of it and had never particularly wanted what it bought, only what it could protect, the basic stability that made everything else possible. She knew that the version of herself that had met Ethan Kingston and married him in the space of 6 weeks was still her. Same history, same values, same instincts. Whatever that woman had felt and thought, it had lived inside the same brain and body and set of lifelong experiences that Sophia was operating from right now. She also knew that she could not stay in this house and pretend the documents weren't sitting in a folder on the kitchen table. She could not continue the slow reconstruction of something she wasn't sure she'd built freely. Not without knowing more. Not without having more to stand on than accumulated small observations and other people's testimony about how she'd seemed on a phone call 8 weeks ago. She needed to be somewhere that was unambiguously hers. She needed, she realized, to go home. Her actual home. Delaney Street. The 3rd floor walk-up with the banging radiator and the fire escape tomatoes. She called her landlord, a man named Griggs, who she'd rented from for 4 years and who had always been, whatever his faults, responsive to maintenance issues. He answered on the 3rd ring, surprised to hear from her, and confirmed that the apartment had been kept. She was paid through the end of the year, apparently, which she hadn't known, and which she suspected she knew the source of, though she didn't go there right now. She started packing. Not everything. She wasn't dramatic about it, didn't treat it as a declaration. She packed a bag, her things, the things she recognized as belonging to her pre-accident life, the Caldwell mug, her books, her notebook, the old quilt from Macon. She left the clothes that had been in the estate's closet when she arrived, the things she couldn't remember choosing. She took her coat from the hook by the door. She wrote Ethan a note. She sat at the desk in her room and tried to write it 3 times and threw away the first 2 because they were either too cold or too explanatory, both of which felt dishonest. The 3rd one said, "I need to be somewhere I know is mine. I don't think this is permanent. I don't know what it is, but I can't think clearly here, and I need to think clearly. I'm sorry." She left it on the kitchen table, weighted down by the Caldwell mug, which she then decided to take anyway because it was hers, and she'd decided. She called a cab. She sat on the front step with her bag and waited, and she was aware that she was waiting for something to stop her, for Ethan to come home early, or for Clara to appear, or for some instinct in herself to say, "Don't wait. This is wrong." She waited for it, and it didn't come. Just the November cold, and a crow on the garden wall again, and the sound of the street. The cab came. The apartment on Delaney Street was cold in the way of places that haven't been lived in for weeks. The particular cold of a space where the heat has been running to keep pipes from freezing, but nothing has moved, no body warmth. The radiator was already doing its thing, which in November meant the clicking and banging overture that preceded actual heat, the sound she had always complained about and was now, stupidly, glad to hear. She put the quilt on the bed. She put the Caldwell mug on the kitchen counter. She stood in the center of her living room and looked at the furniture she'd chosen and the books she'd organized and the small evidence of 6 years of living in this specific place, and she felt simultaneously better and hollowed out. Better because this was hers. Unambiguously, memorably, verifiably hers. Hollowed out because the house she'd left had also, somehow, without her planning it, started to feel like something. She called her mother that evening. Patrice Harper answered with the specific tone of a woman who has been waiting for a call without letting on that she's been waiting. "Where are you?" Patrice said. "Home. Delaney." A pause. "What happened?" Sophia told her. The documents, the trusts, the dates. The same story she'd told Diana, but told differently this time. Slower, with more of the feeling in it, because this was her mother, and the performance of composure wasn't required. Patrice listened without interrupting, which was unusual and meant she was taking it seriously. When Sophia finished, there was a long pause. "Can I ask you something?" Patrice said. "That's never stopped you. Do you think he did it to buy you?" Sophia looked at her wall, at the print she'd hung there 5 years ago, a photograph of a piano in an empty room with the light coming through a window at an angle. "No," she said, and then, "I don't know. I don't think so, but I can't." "That's not the question," Patrice said. "I said, do you think he did it to buy you? Not do you know, not can you prove it. Do you, Sophia Ann Harper, with the brain you've had your entire life and the judgment you've developed in 30 years, think that man set up that money to purchase your yes?" Sophia was quiet. "No," she said finally. "I don't think he did." "So what are you actually afraid of?" The question landed the way her mother's questions had always landed, directly, without cushioning, finding the thing underneath the stated thing. What was she actually afraid of? Not that he'd bought her. She'd said no to that and she'd meant it. She was afraid that she'd let herself be bought without knowing it. That the version of herself who'd said yes had been moved by the safety net even while believing she wasn't. That the love, whatever it had been, whatever it was becoming, had been downstream of security in a way she'd been too close to see. She was afraid that she was exactly who the tabloids assumed she was, and that she'd never know, and that Ethan would never be able to know either, and that the entire foundation of what they'd been building and rebuilding rested on a question that might be permanently unanswerable. "I'm afraid I can't trust myself," she said. Patrice was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most honest thing you've said since you woke up in that hospital," she said. "Is that a comfort or a diagnosis?" "Both," said Patrice. They talked for another hour, about nothing important. Her mother's neighbor's garden, a cousin's new job, the weather in Macon. The kind of conversation that is not about its content, that is just the voice of someone who knew you before you knew yourself, proof that you had a continuous existence before the accident and would have one after. When Sophia hung up, the apartment was warm. The radiator had settled into its rhythm. Outside the window, she could hear the street, the specific sound of her specific block that she'd been falling asleep to for 6 years. She made tea with the last of the good tea bags she'd left behind, and she sat on her couch, and she let herself be there without making it mean anything. She thought about Clara playing the wrong version of Heart and Soul over and over with her small jaw set. She thought about a note in her own handwriting. He makes it sweet for you without making it a thing. She thought about Ethan's face in the hallway after she'd said, "I don't know if I chose you or the floor you built first, the way he'd let it land without flinching away from it. She thought about a folder of legal documents on a kitchen table, irrevocable trusts administered by an independent fiduciary, a man trying to solve with money the one thing money couldn't solve, which was certainty. He couldn't give her back the 6 weeks. He couldn't give her the memory of her own choosing. He'd tried to give her the next best thing, the conditions under which a free choice was possible. And he'd done it imperfectly, the way all significant human gestures are imperfect, because you cannot completely anticipate the specific shape of your own absence from someone's memory. She sat with all of it. She did not arrive at a conclusion that night. What she arrived at slowly was a question she hadn't been asking in the right form. She'd been asking, can I trust him? She'd been gathering evidence for and against, building a case, trying to arrive at a verdict. But the question she hadn't asked, the question that had been sitting underneath everything, in the hallway and the kitchen and the piano bench and the cold cab ride back to Delaney Street, was different. The real question was, can I trust myself to know the difference? Not can she trust Ethan. She had enough information about Ethan. She had more information about Ethan than she had about most people she'd known for years. She'd been watching him with the careful attention of someone who can't rely on memory and has to see everything as it actually is. The question was whether she trusted her own perception, her own judgment, the instincts that had been present and operational every day since she'd woken up in room 214, even with the gap in them, even with the hole. Your hands remember things even when your brain forgets. She'd said that, apparently, to a 7-year-old girl who'd taken it on faith. She looked at her left hand. The ring was still there. She hadn't taken it off. She wasn't sure what that meant or if it meant anything. She'd been wearing it for weeks without thinking about it, the same way you stop thinking about a watch after the first few days. Her hands remembered things. She looked at the ring for a long time. Then she turned out the light and lay down on her bed under the old quilt from Macon, and the radiator banged its rhythm through the cold apartment, and somewhere on the fire escape above her someone's dead tomato plants rattled in the November wind, and Sophia Harper pressed her left hand against the mattress and let herself sit in the not knowing without trying to resolve it tonight. She would figure out what she trusted tomorrow. Tonight, she just breathed. She lasted 4 days on Delaney Street before the silence started working against her. Not the silence of the apartment itself. The apartment was never fully silent, not with the radiator and the street noise and the upstairs neighbor who apparently did something involving heavy furniture at 11 p.m. with reliable consistency. It was the other kind of silence, the internal kind, the kind that fills up when you've removed yourself from the situation you've been trying to think clearly about and discovered that clarity doesn't automatically follow distance. She went back to the center every day, which helped. She wasn't officially reinstated. Her leave covered the rest of the month, which James had arranged without her asking, the particular grace of someone who understood that recovery was not a fixed timeline. But she came in anyway, not to teach, just to be there. She sat in practice room 4 when it wasn't occupied and played through her own lesson plans, relearning the specific pedagogical texture of each student's strengths and weak spots from her own notes. Marcus and his rushing, Priya and her tendency to play the right notes in the wrong emotional register, technically accurate and effectively flat. Mr. Okafor, 61 years old, who had told Sophia on his first lesson that he wasn't trying to be good, he was trying to feel something, and who had turned out to be the student who made her think hardest about what teaching actually was. She made her own coffee in the center's small break room from the same ancient machine James had been complaining about for 3 years. And it tasted the way it always tasted, which was bad in a specific and familiar way. And she held the Caldwell mug and felt the weight of the past few years in it. She thought a lot. In the way you think, when you've been living inside a problem for long enough that you've stopped looking at it clearly and need to back up and look at the shape of the whole thing from a distance. What she kept returning to was not the documents, not the legal language, not the dates, not the irrevocable structures of the trusts. Those were facts, and she'd absorbed them, and she'd said what they'd made her feel, and she was trying to move past the initial reaction into something more considered. What she kept returning to was the conversation in the kitchen. Not its content, his words, his explanation, but the texture of it. The way he'd sat across from her and hadn't tried to manage her response, hadn't reached for reassurance or deflection or the particular rhetorical move that people with money and lawyers make
when they're trying to reframe an inconvenient truth. He'd told her what he'd done and why, and had then sat there and let her be whatever she was going to be about it. He hadn't tried to control the outcome. She kept thinking about that. She was also, though she was less ready to examine this part, thinking about Clara. Clara had called her cell phone on the second day. The call had been short. Clara was not a long phone call person. She approached the telephone with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had things to say and no patience for the medium. And the content of it had been, "Edmund wants to know if you're coming back. I'm asking for him because he won't say it himself." Sophia had been standing in the center's corridor when the call came in and had pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and tried to locate her voice. "Tell Edmund I don't know yet," she'd said. "That's what I figured," Clara had said, unsurprised. "He says okay?" A pause. "The left-hand part is getting better." "Good. Also, Dad burned the eggs this morning." There was a silence. "I'm sorry to hear that," Sophia said carefully. "He said it was fine, and it wasn't," Claire said. "But I didn't argue because he had a face." "What kind of face?" "The kind he gets," Claire said, with the particular precision of a child describing something she'd been observing for years. "When something's wrong, but he's not going to say it's wrong. He used to get it when people talked about my mom. Now he gets it about different things." Sophia had not known what to say to that, so she'd said nothing, and Clara had apparently decided the call's purpose had been served and hung up after a brief and businesslike goodbye. She thought about that call on the third night, lying in her bed listening to the radiator, and she thought about what it meant that a 7-year-old had identified the face her father made when something was wrong and had called Sophia to report it. And she thought about what it meant that the reporting had felt less like manipulation and more like information delivered by someone too young and too straightforward to be strategic about it. She thought about the eggs. On the morning of the 5th day, she called Rachel. This was not the obvious call to make. Rachel Kingston was Ethan's sister and therefore not a neutral party, and Sophia had enough self-awareness to know she was reaching for something specific. Not reassurance, she told herself, but testimony from someone who had been watching Ethan from the outside long enough to know the difference between the version he presented and the version that was actually there. Rachel picked up on the 4th ring and didn't sound surprised. "I wondered when you'd call," Rachel said. "You knew I left?" "Ethan told me." A pause. "He also told me why in broad terms. He doesn't complain, but he's not great at hiding when he's carrying something." "I have questions," Sophia said, "and I'm aware that you're his sister, so you can tell me if this is not a conversation you want to have." "Ask," Rachel said. "Was he like this with Vivian before she died? The way he is, the radius he keeps, the not pushing." There was a pause. Rachel was clearly thinking about whether and how to answer this. "No," she said finally. "He wasn't." "What was he like?" "He was more present, more demanding, more sure of how things should go. Vivian was from the same world he grew up in, and they'd known each other's families for years, and I think he was comfortable in a way that made him less careful." Rachel's voice was measured. She died, and he spent 2 years trying to figure out who he'd actually been to her, whether the marriage had been what he thought it was. He never arrived at a clean answer, and I think it changed how he understood himself. Sophia sat with that. "And then he met you," Rachel said, "and I've never seen him work so hard to make sure someone had a way out." She paused. "Which I know that's probably part of what's bothering you, that he set it up before you said yes." "It's the part I keep coming back to," Sophia said. "Can I tell you something that might be uncomfortable? Apparently that's what this call is for. The way he set it up, the irrevocability, the independence, making sure you could leave at any point and still be fine, that's not the behavior of a man who's confident you'll stay," Rachel said. "That's the behavior of a man who was terrified you'd leave and trying to make sure his terror didn't become your problem." A pause. "He wasn't securing you. He was trying to make sure you'd never feel trapped. There's a difference, and I know from the outside it probably looks the same." Sophia was quiet. "He's not perfect," Rachel said. "He's bad at asking for help, and he works too much, and he has exactly one mode when he's feeling something he doesn't know how to handle,
which is to become very still and very quiet, and hope the feeling resolves itself, which it usually doesn't. She paused. But he has never in the 6 years since Vivian died met anyone he cared about protecting more than he cared about keeping. She paused. Until you. Sophia looked out her window at the fire escape. Rachel, she said, do you think I married him for the money? The pause this time was shorter. I think, Rachel said carefully, that you're the only person who can answer that. But I'll tell you what I saw when I met you. I saw a woman who was annoyed about being at that party in the first place, who argued with my brother about the center funding the first time she met him, and who, when he showed up on her doorstep a week after they met and said he wanted to take her to dinner, told him she already had plans and he could come back on Saturday if he wanted. Something shifted in Sophia's chest. He came back on Saturday? She said. He rearranged a board meeting, Rachel said. He told me later it was the best decision he'd made in years. After she hung up with Rachel, Sophia sat for a long time at her kitchen table. The morning was gray, the particular gray of a December day deciding whether or not to snow, and the light through the window was flat and without direction. She thought about what Rachel had said. She thought about the notes she'd written herself, and the sticky C-sharp, and the sugar on the counter every morning. She thought about Clara's phone call and the burned eggs and the face he gets when something's wrong, but he's not going to say it's wrong. She thought about what it actually meant to choose freely. She'd been treating it as a binary. Either her choice had been completely independent of any external influence, or it hadn't been a real choice at all. But that wasn't how choosing actually worked. Nobody chose anything in a vacuum. Every decision was made within a context, shaped by circumstances and timing and what was available. The question wasn't whether the context existed. The question was whether you'd responded to it honestly, with your actual values and actual judgment, or whether you'd been moved by something you weren't acknowledging. She knew her values. She'd had 30 years to learn them. She was not a woman who valued security over integrity. She was not a woman who made peace with things that felt wrong because the alternative was uncomfortable. She had walked away from 2 relationships that were comfortable enough and gone on being fine on her own, not because she didn't want connection, but because she refused to stay in the wrong one for the wrong reasons. She had, apparently, walked into a marriage with a billionaire inside 6 weeks, which meant the woman who'd made that choice had not been moved by security, not primarily. Because security alone would have told her to be slower, more cautious, more protected. Security would have said, wait, watch, don't commit to something you can't unmake quickly. She'd committed fast. That was not the behavior of a woman responding to a safety net. That was the behavior of a woman who'd found something she recognized and moved toward it before she had time to talk herself out of it. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth. She needed to talk to him. Not because she had everything resolved. She didn't. Not because she'd arrived at certainty. She hadn't. And she was starting to think certainty might be the wrong standard, might be the thing she'd been waiting for that was never going to come and didn't have to. She needed to talk to him because she'd said something in that hallway that deserved more than a note on the kitchen table and 4 days of silence, and because whatever she was going to do next, she wasn't going to do it from Delaney Street without having said everything she needed to say to his face. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was even. Sophia. Can I come over? She said. I'm not announcing anything. I just need to talk to you. A pause. Brief. Yes, he said. Of course. She took a cab. She didn't want to manage a car right now. She wanted to sit in the back seat and look out the window and have 40 minutes of someone else doing the navigating. The gate was open when she arrived. She walked up the drive, and the house was lit in the gray December afternoon, and the fountain in the circular drive was still off for the season. He opened the door before she knocked. He looked, she noted it without editorializing, like someone who had not been sleeping well, not dramatically, not like a man in a film who'd visibly fallen apart, just the specific fine-grained tiredness of a person who had been managing a difficult thing for several days without adequate rest. He was in a sweater and jeans and had clearly been home for a while. He stepped back to let her in. They went to the kitchen because that was where they always ended up, the room that had accumulated the most of their real conversations. And he put on coffee without asking, and she sat down at the table and put her hands flat on its surface and tried to organize what she'd come to say. He set the coffee in front of her. He sat down across the table. He waited. "I talked to Rachel," she said. Something moved briefly through his expression. "I didn't ask her to." "I called her," Sophia said. "She didn't reach out to me. I needed perspective from someone who wasn't you and wasn't Diana, and she was the obvious choice." She paused. "She told me some things." "What kind of things?" "That you were different with Vivian. That losing her changed how you understood yourself. That you've spent 6 years trying to be someone who doesn't repeat whatever you thought you got wrong." She looked at him. "And that you rearranged a board meeting to come back on a Saturday because I told you to." He was still. "Is that accurate?" she said. "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." She looked at her coffee. "I need to say some things, and I need you to let me get through them before you respond." "Okay." "What I said in the hallway, about not knowing if I chose you or the floor you built, I meant it. I still don't have the memory of choosing, and I don't know if I'm going to get it, and I've been sitting with that for 5 days, and it's not getting easier." She paused. "But I've also been thinking about what it actually means to choose freely, and I think I've been holding myself to a standard that nobody could meet, that no choice is real unless it happens in a vacuum, with no context, no circumstances, no external anything. And that's not how any decision ever gets made by anyone." He didn't move. "I know my values," she said. "I know I'm not a person who would marry someone for security. I know that because I know myself, and the accident took 6 weeks of my memory and not 30 years of my character." She stopped. "And when I look at the choice I apparently made, from the outside, with everything I know, the speed of it, the commitment of it, the fact that I packed my things and moved into this house and apparently found it important to document the way you put sugar on the counter." Her voice caught slightly on that, and she stopped and pulled it back. "That's not the behavior of a woman who is looking for a floor to stand on. That's the behavior of a woman who found something she recognized and didn't wait." He was watching her with an expression she'd seen before, the contained, careful stillness of someone holding something in with considerable effort. "But I need you to explain something to me," she said, "and I need the full version, not the version you gave me in the kitchen. I need to understand what you were actually afraid of when you set up those trusts, not the logic, the underneath of it." He was quiet for a long moment. "I told you about Vivian," he said. "Tell me the part you didn't tell me." He exhaled slowly. "There was a night," he said, "about 8 months before she died. We'd been in a bad stretch, nothing catastrophic, just the slow erosion that happens when two people have been busy and disconnected for long enough." And she said something that I thought about for years afterward. He paused. She said, "Sometimes I don't know if I would have chosen this differently, if things had been different." And I asked her what she meant, and she said she wasn't sure. And we didn't talk about it again because we were both conflict avoidant in our different ways. And then she died, and I never got to find out what she meant. He looked at the table. She might have meant nothing. She might have been in a bad mood and said something that didn't represent anything real. But I didn't know. I couldn't ask. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Whether the structure of our life together had gotten in the way of her ever knowing, clearly, independently, whether she was there because she wanted to be. He paused. I couldn't give Vivian back the chance to know that clearly. But I thought, if I ever... He stopped, started again. I thought if I ever found someone again, I could at least make sure the question was answerable. Make sure there was nothing structural between her and her own choosing. The kitchen was very quiet. "Ethan," Sophia said. He looked at her. "That's not what you actually feared, is it?" she said. "Not fully." He held her gaze. "No," he said finally. "Not fully." "What was the rest?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I was afraid that you'd figure out I was worth loving and then decide the price was too high. The life, the coverage, the loss of privacy, the weight of all of this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the name, all of it. "I was afraid that if you had an easy out, you'd eventually take it. And I was simultaneously afraid that if you didn't have an easy out, I'd never know if you were staying because you wanted to or because leaving was hard." He stopped. I built the trust because I couldn't tolerate the uncertainty either way. It was the only thing I knew how to do. It didn't solve the uncertainty, she said. I know that now. You traded one kind for another. Yes, he said. I know. She looked at him. He looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of an unanswerable question for years and had built an elaborate structure to avoid it and was now sitting across a kitchen table acknowledging that the structure hadn't worked. He was not smooth about it. He was not handling this gracefully. His jaw was tight, and he was looking at the table again, and his hands around his coffee cup were not relaxed. She felt something in her chest move deliberately toward him. Can I tell you what I think? She said. He looked up. I think you're the most complicated form of thoughtful I've ever encountered, she said. I think you tried to solve an emotional problem with a legal instrument, which is an extremely specific kind of failure mode that I suspect is documented throughout your entire history. And I think you knew on some level it wasn't going to work, and you did it anyway because you needed to do something. And I think... She paused. I think the fact that you gave away the control before you asked me anything is the most honest thing you could possibly have done, even if the execution was imperfect. He was very still. I'm not okay, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here telling you I've resolved everything and it's all fine. I still don't have the memory. I still don't know what I felt on the specific day I said yes. I'm probably going to have moments where that bothers me for a long time. She met his eyes. But I'm not willing to let the absence of something I can't get back be the reason I don't do the thing I'm pretty sure I'd do anyway. What thing? He said carefully. Stay, she said. Be here. Figure this out. The word landed between them. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't move toward her or reach for her or produce any of the gestures that the moment seemed to be calling for. He just sat with it. Let it be real, the same way he let difficult things be real, without trying to rush past them or wrap them up into something neater than they were. You don't have to decide anything today, he said. I know. I'm not deciding anything today. She looked at him steadily. I'm just telling you where I am. Okay, he said, and I want you to tell me something. What? The board meeting, the Saturday. She held his gaze. What was the dinner? Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. A softening around his eyes, a relaxation in his jaw. A place on Meridian Street, he said. You ordered the fish and complained that it was overpriced, and then ate all of it and admitted it was worth it. She waited. You told me about a student, he said. Mr. Okafor, the man who wanted to feel something. You talked about him for 20 minutes, and you didn't seem to realize how much you lit up when you talked about teaching. He paused. I'd been in a lot of dinners with a lot of people, and I'd never seen someone talk about their work that way. Like it was the most important thing in the room. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm going back to Delaney tonight, she said. I need a little more time in a space that's mine. He nodded immediately. No argument, no push. Of course. But I'm going to come back, she said. And when I do, I need things to be different than they were. Different how? Less radius, she said. I appreciate the space you've been giving me. I needed it, but I don't want to be handled. She paused. I want you to argue with me occasionally. I want you to tell me when something bothers you instead of going very still and hoping it resolves itself. Something crossed his face. Rachel told you that, he said. She confirmed it. I'd already noticed. He looked at her with something she couldn't entirely name. Relief was part of it, and something more complicated. I can try, he said. I should tell you, I'm not great at that. The telling people when something bothers me. I know, she said. I'm not great at staying in situations that scare me instead of building distance. He looked at her. We're both going to be bad at this, she said. Probably, he agreed. Okay, she said. That's actually easier to work with than the alternative. She went home to Delaney Street that evening, took the same cab route, same gray December light, same radiator waiting to bang its welcome. She made dinner for herself, actual dinner, not just toast, which had been her primary emotional regulation food for 5 days. And she sat at her small kitchen table and ate it and did not think too hard about anything. She texted Clara, just, "Tell Edmund the left-hand part will keep getting better if you keep practicing." The response came 4 minutes later, which meant Clara had been in proximity to a phone. He says he knows. "Also, I'm almost ready for the right hand." Sophia looked at this text for a moment and then replied, "Don't rush it. Get the left hand solid first. You always say that, because it's always true." A pause. Then, "Are you coming back?" She set the phone down on the table and looked at the wall across from her, and she thought about a 7-year-old girl with a rabbit named Edmund and a strong sense of justice and a very accurate read on her father's face. She picked the phone back up. "Yes," she typed. "I'm coming back." She wasn't rushing it. She was getting the foundation solid first. That was what the next 2 weeks were. She moved between Delaney Street and the estate with a deliberateness she'd decided on. Not randomly, not reactively, but with intention. She came back on a Thursday with one more bag of her things, and she stayed through the weekend, and on Sunday afternoon she and Clara spent 3 hours working through Heart and Soul in its complete form, both hands together, the halting, imprecise duet of a student approaching something difficult, and a teacher who remembered exactly why the difficulty was worth it. It wasn't clean. Clara kept losing the coordination between her hands and having to restart, and Sophia kept stopping her mid-measure to correct the timing. And by the end of it, neither of them had performed anything particularly impressive, but Clara could play the piece from beginning to end without stopping, and that was the thing that mattered. Ethan appeared in the doorway at some point. She registered him there the same way she'd registered him in the hallway outside Clara's room 6 weeks ago, and this time she didn't look away when she noticed. She met his eyes briefly and then looked back at Clara's hands. He came in and sat on the couch without being invited, and he was there for the rest of it, not participating, just present, the way he was present, at no radius at all now, just himself in the room. When Clara finally played it through to the end, messy and alive and 100% hers, she looked up at Sophia with the expression of someone who has accomplished something real and knows it. "Good," Sophia said. "Really good or just good?" "Really good. The ending still drags, but the bones are there." Clara nodded seriously. "I'll work on the ending," Ethan said from the couch. "You've been working on that for 3 weeks." "Dad," Clara said with the weary patience of a child explaining something for the 100th time, "learning things takes time." Sophia looked at Ethan. He looked at her. There was a moment between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have read as significant from the outside. Just a shared recognition, quiet and particular, the kind that accumulates between people over time and that you can't manufacture and can't describe precisely and can only receive when it arrives. She looked away first. She told Clara to practice the ending 10 more times and moved away from the keyboard to let her. Later, when Clara was in her room and Sophia was in the kitchen making tea, because she'd been here long enough that she knew where the kettle was and what Clara's preferred mug was and where Ethan's tea was kept, he came in and stood on the other side of the counter and looked at her. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back." "I said I would." "I know." He paused. It matters that you did." She handed him the tea she'd made without being asked, because she knew how he took it and she'd made it without thinking. He looked at the mug in his hand. He looked at her. She thought, standing in that kitchen in the gray December light, with the sound of Clara practicing upstairs filtering through the ceiling, that this was what it looked like from the inside. Not the version in the tabloids, not the version in anyone's assumptions about what a woman like her was doing with a man like him. This, the tea made correctly without being asked, the sound of a kid upstairs working on an ending that dragged, the particular quality of two imperfect people choosing to stand in the same room and try. She still didn't have the memory. She was no longer sure she needed it. She needed this. The present tense version of it, the one she was building note by note in real time. The one that didn't depend on a 6-week window she'd never get back. She picked up her own tea and looked out the window at the winter garden. "The fountain," she said. "When does it come back on?" "March, usually," he said, "when the hard frosts are done." Clara mentioned she wants to put fish in it in the spring. "She mentions that every spring," he said. "We've never done it." "Why not?" He paused. "I never looked into it." I'll look into it, she said. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that doesn't announce itself as significant. She would look into whether the fountain could support fish. She would be here in March to see it come back on. She would still be here in spring. She hadn't decided that consciously. It had come out as a sentence naturally, the way things come out when they're true. He was quiet beside her for a moment. Sophia, he said. I'm glad you didn't take the ring off. She looked at her left hand wrapped around the mug. The ring caught the kitchen light, simple gold, worn smooth at the edges. She hadn't taken it off. Not in the hospital, not on Delaney Street, not in any of the days of not knowing and trying to think clearly and being scared. It had stayed on her finger through all of it, and she hadn't examined that too closely because examining it felt like too much, and now she was examining it, and what she found was she hadn't taken it off because it didn't feel wrong to be wearing it. It never had. Even when everything else was uncertain, even when she didn't know anything about the man whose name was on the other half of the certificate, the ring had sat on her finger and felt like something that had been put there correctly. Her hands remembered. I didn't either, she said quietly. And then, because the moment was already more than either of them had been planning for, and she didn't want to push it further than it could hold, the fish research will probably take a while. Clara's going to have opinions. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. The most genuine thing she'd heard from him, not managed, not careful, just real. She'll want specific fish, he said. By name. Obviously, Sophia said. She drank her tea. He drank his. Outside, the December garden was bare and cold and waiting for March. March came slowly, the way it always does in a city that has earned its winters. Reluctantly, in fits and starts, with a week of genuine warmth followed by 3 days of cold that felt like a personal insult, the kind of weather that required you to commit to spring before spring had fully committed to you. The fountain came back on in the second week of March. Ethan had someone come to service it in late February, quietly, without announcing it, and Sophia noticed the work crew in the garden on a Tuesday morning from the kitchen window, and didn't say anything, just made a note of it the way she made notes of small things now. Not writing them down, just filing them in the part of herself that had been paying attention for months. The fountain ran a test cycle on a Thursday afternoon, and Clara stood at the living room window watching it with the serious attention of a person doing quality control, and declared it acceptable. The fish question had been negotiated over approximately 6 weeks in December and January, with the seriousness Clara brought to all significant decisions, which was considerable. There had been a library visit. Diana had been roped in because Clara had decided that a librarian was the correct resource for fish research, which Diana had taken as a professional compliment, and a printed document that Clara had produced and presented at the kitchen table one Sunday morning like a formal proposal. The document covered 3 species of suitable pond fish, their respective requirements, their names. The names were non-negotiable. Clara had made clear the fish would have names before they arrived, and a feeding schedule. Ethan had read the document with the same attention he gave to Kingston Properties board materials, which Sophia had watched from across the table, trying not to smile. "You've been thorough," he'd said. "Sophia said to get the foundation solid first," Clara had said, "before you build anything on top of it." He'd looked at Sophia then. She'd looked back. Neither of them had commented. The fish arrived in mid-March, 3 of them, a pond variety that the pet shop owner had confirmed could manage the fountain's circulation system, placed with ceremony by Clara on a Saturday morning, while Sophia stood at the edge of the fountain and watched. Clara had named them already, of course, Edmund II, in honor of, not a replacement for, Clara had specified, the distinction apparently important, Steinway, which was Clara's contribution to Sophia's professional vocabulary, and Patterson, named for a teacher at Clara's school who Clara had decided deserved a fish named after her. "Edmund II is the biggest," Clara said, watching them settle. "He's in charge." "Fish don't have hierarchies," Ethan said. "These ones do," Clara said, with the serene confidence of someone whose internal world was fully self-consistent. Sophia crouched at the edge of the fountain and watched the 3 fish move through the water, slow and deliberate, adjusting to a new environment with the particular patience of things that don't have the option of panic.
She thought about patience. She'd been thinking about it a lot, in the way you think about qualities you've had to practice rather than ones that came naturally. She was still not a woman who was comfortable with uncertainty. She suspected she never would be.
But she'd learned, in the months since she'd woken in room 214 with a ring on her finger and a stranger beside her bed, that the absence of certainty was not the same as the absence of truth. That you could know something real without being able to prove it in a way that would satisfy a courtroom or a tabloid, or the anxious part of yourself that kept demanding documentation. She knew things, not all things, not the specific things she'd lost, but things that mattered. She knew who Ethan Kingston was, not because she'd been told or because she'd reconstructed it from evidence, but because she'd watched him for 4 months in the unglamorous specific detail of daily life, the burned eggs and the board meetings he rearranged, and the way he sat on the floor to do homework, and the conversations he had with Clara, where he didn't give easy answers, even when easy answers would have ended the conversation faster. She knew him in the way you know someone when you've seen them tired and wrong and uncertain and still fundamentally themselves, which is the only kind of knowing that counts. She knew who she was. She'd always known this, but the accident had tested it in a way nothing else had stripped away the continuous narrative of her life and left her with just the raw material of herself, the values and instincts and ways of seeing that had survived every external change. She was still the woman who argued about defunding policy with strangers at fundraisers, still the woman who'd written notes to herself about small kindnesses because she thought they deserved to be recorded, still the woman who needed the Caldwell mug and the old quilt and the specific comfort of things that were unambiguously hers. And she knew, had known, she thought, for a long time. Maybe since the kitchen in December and the fish research document, and 100 mornings of sugar already on the counter, that she was also the woman who had looked at Ethan Kingston and recognized something she hadn't been looking for and moved toward it before she had time to be sensible about it. She didn't need the memory of the first time she'd done that. She was doing it again, right now, in real time, with her eyes open and her history intact and no gap in her knowledge of herself. She stood up from the fountain's edge and brushed her hands on her jeans. Edmund II is definitely the biggest, she confirmed. Claire looked vindicated. The winter recital at the Caldwell Center had happened in late December, and Sophia had been back teaching full-time since January, which had been the most restorative thing she'd done since the accident. Not because it was easy. Her first week back had been genuinely hard. The relearning of rhythms she'd known for years, the readjustment to the particular demands of each student, the moment in her second lesson with Mr. Okafor when he'd played through something she'd assigned and looked up and said simply, "You're back." And she'd had to excuse herself to the hallway for 2 minutes. But because it was hers, because the work was hers, the relationships were hers, the specific usefulness of being the person who could hear what was wrong in someone's playing and find the words to fix it, that was hers in a way that had survived everything. Marcus had graduated to a Beethoven piece that was slightly above his current level, which Sophia had assigned deliberately because he needed the challenge of something he couldn't rush through. Priya was working on dynamics for the first time with real understanding, learning the difference between playing notes correctly and playing music. Mr. Okafor had learned 6 pieces in the months she'd been away from the substitute instructor, none of them particularly well executed. All of them clearly practiced with the serious feeling he'd told her from the beginning was the point. She loved the work. She'd always loved it. The accident hadn't changed that, and neither had the months in Ethan's house, and neither would anything else she could imagine. She was a piano teacher at a community center in a city that didn't always fund the things that mattered, and that was not a small thing to be. It was, in fact, the specific thing she'd been built for. James had noticed. He'd said it to her in his office one afternoon in February, with his terrible coffee and his 20 years of this particular fight tiredness. "You're better than you were." "Before the accident?" she'd said. "No," he'd said. "Before Kingston." She'd sat with that. Not because she wanted to give Ethan credit for something she'd done herself, but because she understood what James meant, which was that something in her had been loosened, some specific tension she'd been carrying, the tension of a woman managing scarcity alone, watching the thing she loved get defunded and fighting for it on an empty budget, and loving her students too much to show them how tired she was. That tension hadn't disappeared, but it had changed character. She wasn't fighting from the same place of near depletion. She told Ethan this one evening because she'd decided in December that she was going to tell him things instead of sitting with them until they fermented into something complicated, which was her default mode and which she was actively working against. She'd said, "James says I'm better than I was before you." He'd been quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" he'd said. "I think I'm different," she'd said. "Whether that's better depends on the metric." "What metric?" She'd thought about this. "I'm less afraid," she'd said finally. "I was afraid for a long time, and I didn't know how much until I wasn't as much." He'd looked at her steadily. "Afraid of what?" "Of the floor giving out," she'd said. "Financially, professionally. Of being the person who loved the thing that didn't get funded, who taught the students who couldn't pay more, who kept showing up for something that the city kept deciding wasn't worth keeping." She'd paused. The fear was right for a long time. The floor was genuinely uncertain, but carrying it alone for years, it gets into how you hold yourself. "And now?" he'd said. "Now the center is funded," she'd said, "and I know that's your money, and I've made my peace with what that means and what it doesn't mean. And I have—" She'd stopped. "I have you." Which is a different kind of floor, not the financial one, just someone who's going to still be there in the morning whether the funding comes through or not. He'd said, after a moment, "I will be." "I know," she'd said. "That's the thing. I know." It was a Sunday in late March when she asked him about the Caldwell Center event. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, in the careful way she thought about large decisions, turning it over, examining it from different angles, waiting to see if it felt right from all of them or just some of them. She'd talked to Diana about it in early March, and Diana had said that it was exactly the kind of thing that sounded insane and was actually the sanest possible response to the situation, and that she should do it. She'd talked to her mother on the phone, and Patrice had been quiet for a while and then said, "Is this what you want? Not what makes sense. What you want." And Sophia had said yes. They were in the garden on a Sunday afternoon, the first day warm enough to be outside without a coat, the March sun still thin but genuinely present, and Clara was somewhere in the house doing homework with the intermittent resistance of a 7-year-old who knew she needed to do it and was negotiating with herself about when. Ethan was reading something on his phone, and Sophia was sitting beside him on the garden bench that caught the afternoon sun, and she said, "I want to do something at the center." He looked up. "An event," she said. "I've been talking to James about it. End of March, beginning of April. It would technically be the spring recital, but I want it to be more than that." She paused. "I want to invite everyone, your family, Diana, Mama, James and the staff, my students and their families." She paused again. "I want to make vows." He was very still. I don't want to recreate what we had," she said. "I don't want a ceremony that tries to copy something I can't remember. I want to do something new. I want to stand in the room where I've been a person for 4 years, with the people who've known me as that person, and choose you in front of all of them." She met his eyes. "With my actual memory, with everything I know right now, not anything I've lost." He held her gaze for a long moment. The garden was very quiet. The fountain ran its soft, constant sound. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm not sure about much," she said honestly. "But I'm sure about this." He reached out, slowly, deliberate, giving her the option to not, and put his hand over hers on the garden bench. She turned her hand over and let their fingers settle together. "Okay," he said quietly. "Yes." The logistics were not simple. They never were. James had to renegotiate the space and the date with 3 other events that were already scheduled, which he did with the particular grim efficiency of someone who had been navigating community center calendar conflicts for 2 decades. Diana coordinated the guests with a librarian's systematic thoroughness that turned out to be exactly the right skill set for the task. Rachel, who had been brought in on the plan in early March and had cried for a solid 90 seconds before pulling herself together and becoming immediately practical, handled the details that required someone who knew how these things worked. Ethan had one request, which he made carefully. "I'd like to say something," he said. "Not vows exactly. Just, I'd like to be able to say something to you in front of the people who matter." He paused. "I'm not great at it in private. Maybe I'll be better with an audience." Sophia had looked at him. "That's not generally how it works." "I know," he said, "but I want to try." The night before, Sophia sat at the piano in the study and played through the piece she'd chosen to perform. She'd been considering it for weeks. What to play, whether to play anything at all, whether the gesture was too on the nose, too easy a metaphor. She'd decided easy metaphors were still true, and the piano was her language, and if she was going to stand in a room and make herself completely readable to the people she loved, she might as well do it in the form that came most naturally. She'd chosen something she'd written herself. A piece she'd composed 3 years ago, in a difficult winter when the center had lost its city funding, and she hadn't been sure they'd survive the year, when she'd been teaching 5 lessons a day and going home to a cold apartment and composing at night, because the composing was the one thing that made the fear smaller. She'd never performed it publicly. It was too personal, too specific to its own moment of origin. She was going to perform it now. She played it through twice in the quiet study, the C-sharp still slightly sticky, still worked around without thinking about it. And she thought about the woman who had written it, alone in a small apartment, scared, loving something that felt like it was slipping, finding a way to say on the piano what she couldn't say out loud. That woman had not known she was going to meet someone who would fund the thing she was scared of losing. She'd been writing from inside the fear, not from the other side of it, but the piece was still true on the other side. The fear had been real, and the love had been real, and both of them were in the music, and that was what made it worth playing. She went to bed that night and slept better than she had since October. The day of the event was a Friday in late March. Sophia arrived at the Caldwell Center early, 2 hours before anyone else, because she'd asked James for the time, and he'd given her the key. She walked through the empty rooms, practice room 4 and the corridor and the small break room with its perpetually malfunctioning coffee machine, and she let herself feel what it felt like to be there in the particular silence of before. She stood at the window in the main room and looked at the building across the street, which was nothing special. A dry cleaner and a dentist's office and the nail salon where Denise got her nails done every 3rd Saturday. The block was not beautiful. The building she was standing in was not beautiful. The afternoon light coming through the windows was good, that particular late March light that arrives at an angle and makes ordinary things look considered. But the room itself was what it was, worn flooring and old paint, and the bulletin board still covered in flyers for events that had already happened and nobody had taken down yet. This was the room. This was the room where she'd become, over 4 years, the specific person she was, where she'd found out she was a teacher in the bone-deep sense, not just someone who could play piano and explain things, but someone who cared enough about her students' development to lose sleep over it, where she'd had the argument about defunding policy with a man from the Arts Foundation at a fundraiser, because that fundraiser had been here, she realized, in this room, the one Rachel had brought her to, the one where she'd met Ethan Kingston while being annoyed about being there. She'd met him here. She hadn't known that. She stood in the middle of the floor and let it settle. She'd met him in this room, in this building, at an event she hadn't wanted to attend, while fighting about something she cared about. And now she was here again, and this time she knew it, and this time she'd planned it. Her hands remembered. People arrived in the mid-afternoon. Her students came first, which was right. They were the native population of this space, the ones for whom it existed, and their presence made the room make sense. Marcus came with his parents and sat in the front row with the particular confidence of a child who'd performed in this room before and wasn't nervous about it. Priya came with her grandmother, who always came to recitals and always cried, a fact which Priya had long since made peace with. Mr. Okafor arrived in his best jacket and took a seat to the side, which was his habitual position, and folded his hands in his lap with the quiet dignity of a man who knew that what was about to happen was worth sitting still for. Diana came and found Sophia immediately, somewhere behind the small stage area James had set up. "How are you doing?" Diana said. "Good," Sophia said. "Nervous, but good." Those are the same thing today, Diana said, and hugged her briefly and efficiently, and then went to find her seat because Diana understood the value of not overmanaging a person before something important. Patrice Harper arrived from Macon at 4:15, having driven up that morning, and found her daughter in the break room and held her face in both hands, the same way she had in room 214 of Mercy General Hospital 5 months ago, and looked at her with the particular scene of a mother who has been watching her child become someone her entire life. "You look like yourself," Patrice said. "I feel like myself," Sophia said. Patrice let go of her face. "Good," she said. "That's enough." Rachel came with her husband and their 2 kids, who immediately identified Clara as the relevant child in the room and disappeared into whatever social ecosystem children create instantly and independently. Clara arrived with Ethan, who had driven them both, and she was wearing a dress she'd chosen herself, dark green, somewhat formal by 7-year-old standards, with Edmund the rabbit tucked under her arm, because there had apparently been a decision that this was an Edmund occasion. Ethan found Sophia briefly before things began. They stood in the corridor outside the main room, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything immediately, which was fine because some things don't need to be said in the moment before. They need to be saved for the moment itself. "Ready?" he said finally. "Almost," she said. "You?" "No," he said honestly. "Good," she said. "Me neither." He looked at her with that thing in his expression she'd learned over months and could now name without difficulty. It was the specific look of a man who was feeling something too large for the social context he was currently in and was very aware of that fact and was not going to manage it away. He was just going to stand there and feel it, which was something he'd gotten better at over the winter. Not perfect. Better. She touched his arm briefly, the way you touch someone when you want to say, "I know," without stopping to say it, and then she went into the room. She started with the students because that was the structure of a recital, and structure mattered, and because beginning with the work grounded everything else in the right truth, that this room was about music, had always been about music, and everything that was going to happen in it today was downstream of that. Marcus played first, the Beethoven piece that was slightly above his current level, and he played it with the particular focused energy of someone trying very hard not to rush, which meant he'd absorbed at least that part of the lesson, even if his right hand still moved faster than he intended in the third phrase. It wasn't clean. It was earnest and alive in his, which was better than clean. Priya played next, and she played her Chopin with the dynamics she'd been working on all winter, the swells and retreats she'd finally learned to trust herself enough to commit to, and her grandmother cried on schedule from the second row. Mr. Okafor played last among the students. He'd chosen a piece she hadn't assigned him, had apparently learned it on his own, practicing in the early mornings, which she hadn't known. It was a simple thing, an old standard, not technically difficult, played with the slowness of a man who was not concerned with tempo, but was very concerned with every individual note. He played it through without mistakes, which he'd told her once wasn't the point, and at the end he sat quietly for a moment before he looked up, and the look on his face was the one he'd described wanting on his first lesson, the one that said he'd felt something. The room was quiet for a beat after he finished. Then the applause came, and it was real. The kind that isn't about politeness. Then Sophia sat at the keyboard. She'd moved the instrument from the practice room to the main space, an upright, not a grand, the one that had been in the center for 12 years and had its own collection of quirks and small imperfections that she knew as well as her own habits. She sat down, adjusted the bench by the specific amount she always adjusted it, and looked out at the room. All of them were there. Her students, her mother, Diana, who was already watching her with the expression of someone who was not going to make it through this dry-eyed and knew it. James in the back, arms crossed, his face doing the thing it did when he was trying to look impartial about something he wasn't impartial about. Rachel. Clara in the front row with Edmund in her lap, watching Sophia with the intense attention of a child who understood that something significant was happening. And Ethan, seated beside Clara, slightly forward in his chair, watching her. She played the piece. She'd composed it in a winter of fear, and now she played it in a different season entirely, and the notes were the same. But the playing was different in the way the same notes are always different depending on the hands delivering them, depending on what those hands have been through. The fear was still in it. She didn't try to smooth it out, didn't try to play it as a resolved thing, because it wasn't a resolved thing. It was the truth of a specific moment that had led to other moments that had led to here. It was 4 minutes long, and she played it without stopping, without looking up, just her hands and the keys and the room she'd been coming to for 4 years. When she finished, she didn't rush the silence. She sat for a moment. Then she stood and turned to face the room. "I want to say something," she said, "and I'm going to say it plainly, because I've never been good at making things sound more organized than they are." The room was very still. 5 months ago, I woke up in a hospital and I didn't know who I'd married," she said. "I didn't know who Ethan was, and I didn't know what I'd been thinking when I said yes to him, and I spent a significant amount of time convinced that I might never know." She paused. "I don't have the memory back. I want to be clear about that. The specific weeks I lost, the conversations and the feelings, and the specific moment I decided, those are still gone, and they might stay gone." She paused. "But I've spent 5 months watching someone, the way you watch someone when you can't rely on what you used to know about them. The way you watch someone when your only information is what's actually in front of you." She looked at Ethan. He was watching her in the way she'd come to recognize as his most honest mode. No management of his expression, no careful presentation. Just him, sitting in a chair in a community center, looking at her. "What I saw was this," she said. "A man who sat beside a hospital bed for 11 days. A man who gave me the code to the gate before I'd decided anything. A man who put sugar on the counter every morning without making it a thing, and who sat on the floor to do fraction homework, and who tried to use legal documents to solve an emotional problem, which was wrong, and was also the most specifically him thing he could have done." She paused. "A man who told me on the first day that I wasn't obligated, and meant it." She stopped. She was not going to cry. She'd decided this. Her students were watching her, and she was a professional, and she was not going to cry in her own community center. She was going to cry in her own community center. She pressed through it. "I can't give him back the memory of the person who chose him the first time," she said. "That woman is gone, in the sense that she's gone for my access. I trust her judgment, because she was me and I know myself. But I can't give him the thing he actually lost, which is someone who remembered." She looked at Ethan. "What I can give him is this. A new one. A choice made with every piece of information I actually have, by a person who knows exactly what she's walking into." She stepped away from the keyboard. "Ethan," she said, "I know who you are. Not the version from the tabloids, not the version from 6 weeks I can't access. The version I've been watching for 5 months, which is the version that stayed on my couch the night of the accident because you didn't want me to be alone in the house, and then never mentioned you'd done it, and I only found out because Rachel told me in March." She watched something move across his face. "The version that called my mother from the hospital before you'd ever spoken to her in person, because you thought she should know. The version who is quietly terrified of doing to someone what you think you did to Vivian, and who built an elaborate irrevocable trust structure instead of talking about it, which I say with zero judgment because I built elaborate physical distance instead of talking about it, and we're both works in progress." A sound moved through the room that was close to laughter, quiet and warm. "I'm choosing you," she said. Again, or for the first time, or some combination of both that doesn't have a clean name. "I'm choosing you in this room, in front of everyone who knows me well enough to have an opinion about it. With all of my memory intact and all of my history available, knowing who you are and who I am, and knowing that we are both going to be bad at this in specific and predictable ways, and choosing it anyway." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I wanted to say." Ethan stood up. He crossed the floor of the Caldwell Community Music Center in 7 steps, and he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her with the expression she'd been trying to name since the first morning in the hospital, the one that wasn't pity or relief or anything she'd cataloged before. She could name it now. It was the expression of a man who had been holding something very carefully for a very long time, and had finally been told he could set it down. "You said I could speak," he said. "I did." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I've been thinking for weeks about what I wanted to say. I had notes. I threw them away this morning." "Okay," she said. "What I actually want to say is that you are the most frustrating person to love that I have ever encountered," he said. And I mean that as a complete and unambiguous compliment. You don't make anything easy, and you don't pretend to, and you left my house and went back to Delaney Street, and I burned the eggs for 4 days, and Clara made me call the pizza place again for the driver, and I was... He stopped. I was glad that you left, because it meant you were making a real choice, and I'd rather you make a real choice that scares me than a comfortable one that isn't actually yours. His voice was not entirely steady. I didn't fall in love with you because you needed me, he said. I fell in love with you because you absolutely did not, and then you chose to anyway. And that is still the most astonishing thing that has ever happened to me. He paused. I'm going to keep putting sugar on the counter. I'm going to keep getting it wrong in the ways I've always gotten it wrong. And you're going to tell me about it, and we're going to have that conversation, probably multiple times. And I'm going to... He stopped. I'm going to be here. In the morning, whatever the morning looks like. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out a ring. Not the one she was wearing. Different. This one was gold, too, simple, but with a small detail at the band, a tiny engraving along the inner edge that she'd have to be very close to read. I had it made in February, he said, when I didn't know if you were coming back. He looked at it in his hand. I had it made because I thought, if she comes back, I want to ask properly. With a ring she chose with me, not one from a day she can't remember. He looked at her. I didn't buy this one until you picked it. She hadn't known this either. She'd gone with him to a jeweler in late February, a Saturday morning, thinking they were doing something administrative about the estate insurance. He'd walked her into the shop and said he wanted to look at simple gold bands, and she'd been confused for about 4 minutes before she'd understood. And then she'd stood at the case and pointed to one and said that one. And he'd said, "Are you sure?" And she'd said, "I'm sure about very little, and yes." She'd forgotten it was for this. She'd forgotten he'd been planning this moment. She looked at the ring in his hand, and she looked at him, and she understood that he'd been carrying this for weeks, waiting for today, wanting it to mean what it meant. A question asked in front of witnesses, with full information, from a woman who remembered everything she needed to remember. "Yes," she said, before he asked, because she didn't need the question to know the answer. Something broke open in his face in the best possible way. He put the ring on her finger, next to the old one, the one that had been on her hand since the day she'd woken up and not recognized it. Both of them there now. The old one she'd found on her finger in room 214, and the new one she'd chosen herself. Both true, both real. Not one replacing the other. Around them the room made sounds. Clara's voice was distinctive above the others, something emphatic about Edmund approving of this, which generated a laugh from everyone within earshot. Sophia heard her mother's particular intake of breath. Diana somewhere clapping before everyone else had started. But she was mostly aware of the man in front of her, whose face had finally, fully, set down the thing he'd been holding. She leaned her forehead against his for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough to say without saying, "I'm here. This is real. We're doing this." He exhaled slowly. "The eggs," he said quietly against her temple. "I'm going to fix the eggs." "You don't have to," she said. "I like making them myself." She could feel him almost laugh. They stood there in the Caldwell Community Music Center, in the particular late March light coming through the windows that weren't beautiful but were hers, surrounded by the people she loved and the students she'd built her adult life in service of, and it was not a perfect moment. Mr. Okafor was quietly blowing his nose in the second row. Clara had gotten Edmund too close to the refreshment table, and someone was trying to redirect her. The room's HVAC system was making the low hum it always made. James was going to need to get these chairs stacked before the building closed at 9. None of this was the kind of thing that got remembered the way you remember the perfect version of moments. It was going to be remembered the way real things get remembered, messy and specific and lit from an angle with all its details intact, because the details were what made it true. Sophia Harper pulled back and looked at Ethan Kingston. She had 2 rings on her left hand. She had all 30 years of herself. She had the full memory of the last 5 months, which was, she'd come to understand, its own kind of first chapter. Not a replacement for what she'd lost, but something that existed alongside it, equally real, equally chosen. She didn't know what the next chapter looked like. Nobody did. That was the nature of it. You made the choice, and then you found out what the choice became. You built the foundation solid, and then you found out what you could build on top of it. You got the left hand right, and then you worked on the ending. She knew who she was. She knew who he was. She knew what they were both bad at, and she was willing to work on the part she was responsible for. That was she had decided enough to start with. That was she had discovered everything. The sticky C-sharp was in the piano behind her. The three fish in the fountain were probably doing whatever fish did in the late afternoon. The city was outside the windows doing all the things the city did, indifferent and constant. Spring was happening, slowly, the way it always happened, committed to before it had fully arrived, chosen on faith, showing up eventually in spite of everything. She took his hand. "Come on," she said. "Claire's about to eat all the cake." He looked over. Clara was, in fact, negotiating access to the dessert table with the focused energy of a child who had decided that ceremony was over and practical matters required attention. "She's strategic," Sophia said. "She gets it from her father," he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." They walked across the room together. Not perfectly, not smoothly. He stopped to say something to James, and she veered toward Diana, and they temporarily separated and then found each other again at the dessert table, where Clara had secured a piece of cake of impressive size and was explaining to Edmund the second why Fish didn't get cake, but it wasn't because she didn't care about him. Sophia looked at the room. All of it. Then she looked away from it, at the ordinary next moment, which was where everything actually lived. She reached for the cake. She was present for it. That was the whole story, really. Not the accident or the documents or the missing memories or the ring she'd woken up wearing. Not even the choice she'd made today in front of everyone, which was real and mattered and would matter for a long time. The story was this. You lose things, sometimes irrevocably, and you don't always get them back. And the getting back is not always the point. Sometimes the point is what you build in the place of what was lost. The new thing that wouldn't exist without the gap. The foundation you lay when you finally understand that certainty is not a prerequisite for commitment. You can choose something you can't fully prove. You can love someone you're still learning. You can plant fish in a fountain before you know how the spring will go and trust the season to arrive. Because seasons do arrive eventually if you wait for them with the right combination of patience and stubbornness and willingness to be changed by what comes. Sophia Harper knew this now in a way she hadn't known it before the accident and might not have learned without it. She would have traded the lesson for the months back without hesitation if trading were possible. It wasn't possible. So she stood in the Caldwell Community Music Center with 2 rings on her left hand and cake on a paper plate and a child beside her describing fish politics to a stuffed rabbit, and she was entirely, specifically, imperfectly here. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.